Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 373, as it's the last Sunday in October. That means it is a Patreon Drydock, and the fact that you're listening to this means that I didn't die spectacularly on my way to, while I was in, or on my way back from Japan, or in any other way I guess for that matter. So, it's time to press on with quite a lot of questions. Let's see how we go. Will Sanders asks, Drac, what was the machining process used to machine a Welin breech block? It looks to have very small corner radii, so I can't picture how they machined the threads up to the inside corners. So this involved digging back through quite a lot of very old publications, including some wartime ones, because yeah, the process of how you actually make these things and how you describe how you do that in detail is actually not particularly well documented in modern sources, at least as far as I can find. And what I did find indicated that this cutting both obviously the breech block and the receiving section within the breech itself was considered to be some of, if not the finest and most skilled work of a large gunmaker in the World War I, World War II period, and obviously slightly before, Welin breech block preceding World War I by a certain amount. And bear in mind, yes, I'm an engineer, I'm not a machinist, so some of the highly technical descriptions that you get back in the first half of the 20th century, a little bit of it went over my head somewhat. I had to look up specific terms, like what exactly do they mean by a Geneva motion when it comes to machinery like this. But in any case, the simplest way of describing it that I can think of is essentially they are cut like you would cut screw threads if you're doing more generic machining. However, the kind of lathe that is used is much more specialized. Compared to a normal lathe, it has a lower speed and higher torque than you would otherwise have, so presumably some form of gearing involved. And it also uses a large number of springs and cams that are all mechanically set and have immense strength. And so as it rotates, you can see the breech block down there at the bottom, as the basic form of the breech block rotates through a given amount of degrees, that then initiates a cam, and together with the springs, that will trigger the cutting head to move by the requisite amount so that it can then cut a separate radius, and on it goes. It's a process that's described as not for the faint-hearted, as well as requiring a great amount of skill, because of course all of this being extremely high tension mechanical stuff, there's huge amounts of crashing and banging going on, and the whole lathe has to be big enough and solidly mounted enough that all of this smashing and banging is being contained, at least as far as could be practically described, wholly within the device without it vibrating and bouncing around and moving, because of course if it does that you're going to get imprecise cutting. So it's got to be massive both in the figurative and the literal sense, and everything has to be held extremely rigidly, which is only going to increase the amount of energy that's released as everything snaps backwards and forwards into place. And of course there is some preliminary cutting done as well, which you can probably discern the exact nature of if you zoom in, particularly on the breech block, but the fine machining is simultaneously one of the most spectacularly violent mechanical processes of any formation of the various parts of a large naval gun, but also one of the most subtly and sublimely skilled of them. And much like the cutting of the rifling of the gun for the shell to follow, this is not something you can afford to in any way, shape or form mess up, because one badly cut thread and you're back to square one starting over. Prusi Antica asks, after watching the video on HMS Basilisk, I was wondering how much could one refit a wooden steam and sail ship if one was inclined to do so? Not that this would necessarily be a good idea or that it would produce a decent fighting ship, but how much can you actually swap out and modernise? Well, if we assume that you're starting out with the generic 1840s wooden-hulled warship, let's say a little bit bigger than Basilisk, because sloops, corvettes, that kind of stuff, have some very hard limits which you'll run into in terms of utility very quickly in the terms of lifespan of a ship. So let's say maybe you're starting off with a 2-decker or a large frigate, something along that size of things. Now, of course, the first thing you can do is install steam power at all, and depending on when you want to do this will depend on how efficient that's going to be. So, like with Basilisk, you could go, oh, we've got a ship on the stocks. Well, let's pause building it. Let's redesign it to have steam from the start, and then we'll not necessarily reconstruct, but at least restart the construction and make any necessary modifications. Of course, you could have a ship already in service, and if you do that, then you have a couple of options. You can either just open it up and drop an engine in and call it a good. Obviously, you have to put the prop shaft in and everything. Now, that's the easiest, quickest, and cheapest way of doing things. However, it also means that you don't really have a huge amount of choice of where the engine's going to go if you don't want to really ruin the trim. And you are going to have to accept a sacrifice in armament because those early engines are going to take up quite a lot of space. And also, if you've got paddle wheels as opposed to screws, then obviously it's going to take up space on the side as well. And the other way of doing it is because it's a wooden ship, you can relatively easily take it into dry dock, cut it in half with a bunch of saws, build a new hull segment in between, thus lengthening the ship, and in that segment that's where you put the engines. So you've made a bigger ship, and overall, even if you do have paddle wheels, the ship's armament capability is either maintained or potentially, if you're using screw propulsion, expanded. Now, of course, the ship's lines and the presence of tumblehome and everything will all be predicated around the idea of sails as the primary or initially possibly only means of propulsion. So whether you have paddles or screws, it's not going to be the world's most efficient situation going forwards. And of course, the downside of chopping a ship in half and sticking a block in the middle of it is it was never designed for that, so its length-to-breadth ratio has changed, so its lines are thrown off anyway. Nonetheless, let's assume that you can proceed on this basis. The next thing, of course, you can do is modernize it by switching out the guns. That's actually relatively easy to do, again, because it's a wooden hull. The guns are designed to be lifted in and out anyway. We're talking about broadside ships at this point. So as long as the guns don't get too large to be too large to handle within the gun deck, and probably at that point also too heavy so they might fall through the deck, you're pretty much in luck. And if the guns need a little bit of a bigger gun port, a little bit of more field of fire, you can do that with an axe and a chisel. And this was actually done. If you visit HMS Unicorn up in Dundee, she was used as a gunnery training ship for a while, and various of her gun ports have been expanded, resized, chamfered, etc. for the various guns that she has on board. Now, of course, that does present an upper limit to what you can do in terms of modernization without, stripping out entire gun decks and rebuilding the ship to the point that you might as well not call it the original ship. But for the time period that we're talking about, 1840s, 50s, 60s, 70s, you can still have a ship that's got a degree of armament. It might not be a frontline ship of the line anymore, but it might still be a very useful patrol ship, frigate equivalent, or something like that. And likewise, with the engines, the earliest steam engines tend to be very big and very inefficient. So as time goes on, as engine technology improves, you're going to get engines of similar power being smaller, or engines of similar size being more powerful. And so if you want to, you can go in and pull the old engine out and put a new engine in, either to save weight and space or to increase speed, depending on what you prefer. And again, your hull shape, size, and lines are going to be the primary limitation on how useful any of that actually is. And if you're using one of the larger wooden hulls as a basis, there is also obviously the possibility later on of armoring it. Now, you can do that in a variety of ways. You can cut the ship down massively to make it a kind of a full-on ironclad, the way that quite a number of ships were converted in the 1860s. Or you could maintain its lines generally and perhaps put a limited degree of armouring, perhaps around the centre of the ship on. But you have to be very careful because, of course, that's a lot of weight in the centre, which on a wooden frame ship may not necessarily be the greatest idea. So you may have to put lighter plating along at least the waterline to help strengthen the rest of the ship. And at that point, you might then either be making a central battery ship of sorts, or at least a ship where part of its guns are protected, but part of its armament, if you keep armament fore and aft, is perhaps not protected. And at that point, we are talking very much about basically a patrol craft for distant stations. And building something from new, especially with an iron hull, is probably just going to be a little bit more efficient, or a composite hull or something like that. So I would say, if you are looking at an 1840s wooden vessel and thinking about how many times can I update the engines, perhaps put in some protection, upgrade armament, etc., and it still be at least a viable solution where just building outright from new isn't massively, massively better, I'd say you could probably keep such a ship going till some point in the 1870s, and then at that point the continuing ongoing costs of a hodgepodge refit are going to offer you a ship that's so massively less capable than a brand new ship, you're better off building the brand new ship. Nathan Redder asks, which of the never-built ships from the 20th century, from Fisher's insane dreadnought designs up to the A150 for the Japanese, H-class for the Germans, maybe the Lions, etc., would be the most financially and strategically practical for each nation, excluding treaty limitations, of course? So if we take a brief look at 4 navies in, let's say, the Japanese, the British, the Americans, and the Germans, for the simple fact we don't have a huge amount of time, I would say for the British, the most financially and strategically practical ship for the early 20th century from never-built designs would actually probably be incomparable. And you might be thinking, hang on a minute, no, this thing is not particularly well protected in its final form, considering the ships it would potentially have having to face off. And 6 20-inch guns is a silly armament, and yes, I would thoroughly agree with you on that point. But my point would be to complete incomparable as she was designed, looking at when she would be laid down. So we'd be talking about the very end of the 1910s, perhaps the very start of the 1920s. In the wider context, that ship would make, and potentially sisters, if you were going to lay down more than one, which Fisher probably would have wanted, having those hulls on the stocks in the early 20s, when you've got the Washington Treaty coming along, would make the perfect excuse to convert them over to aircraft carriers. And they're going to be, okay, not quite as overwhelmingly more massive compared to something like a Lexington or an Akagi as they would be when Fisher first conceived the incomparable compared to ships of the mid-1910s, or at least first conceived incomparable in roughly the form that we see it in various designs and descriptions. But it would still actually be somewhat larger, and it would give the Royal Navy one or more exceptionally large, very useful aircraft carriers going through the 1920s and 30s, as opposed to Courageous, Glorious and Furious and assorted others, which, with the best will in the world, while they were useful, I don't think were anywhere near as useful for the Fleet Air Arm as a 1,000-foot plus carrier would have been. For the Germans, I would dismiss any thought of the H-class altogether. The ones that are slightly more sane and practical, like H-39, they're not going to change anything, and they're probably going to arrive too late anyway. And the really big monster stuff is almost entirely paper designs that physically wouldn't be able to be built in German yards as they existed in the early 40s anyway. For the Germans, in terms of most financially and strategically practical, they did have some rather interesting ideas around cruiser design that were drawn up for the Z plan. So if they had some of those either somewhat earlier, or if they pressed ahead with building them as very quickly once they were conceived, I think those would have actually been far more useful overall. Although, to be honest, the most practical and overall useful thing they could have built, given their situation, we're talking about World War II Germany, would have been some kind of standardized 15 to 1600 ton, maybe fractionally larger destroyer design that they could build in bulk, rather than the monstrously large things that they ended up building or trying to build and the things like the Elbings, which, well, I said before, would probably have been a much better bet to mass produce than the big destroyers, that they are a little bit underpowered compared to some destroyers they might be called to face off against. For the Japanese, I actually think some of the slightly less off-the-wall Congo replacements that were designed in the early 1930s would probably be the most financially and strategically practical for them. Yes, there are a few interesting things in the armour scheme, like the hyper-compact hexagonal citadel that you find in some of them. But ultimately, in terms of squeezing a fast 16-inch heavily armoured capital ship into 35,000 tons, they're actually very interesting designs. And yes, they would have some vulnerabilities because of the hyper-compact citadel and so forth. But given that you would be looking at a situation where the Japanese would ostensibly be saying they're going to scrap the Congos when these new ships come into service, and then almost certainly not scrap the Congos, because by the time those ships come into service, the Japanese will have abandoned all pretense of following the treaty system. And you'd also get them in service, comfortably before the outbreak of World War II. They would make a very interesting problem for the Allies, because they would be fast, modern-ish 16-inch armed ships that would take a fair bit of cracking to, deal with. Might give the Japanese an excuse to either dispose of or at least mothball the Fusos and Iseis for other purposes. And yes, obviously the Japanese are still going to have fuel concerns and so forth, but even if they if they bench the Fusos and Iseis and move the Congos over to second line duties, these things wandering around the Guadalcanal campaign would be a considerably greater threat. And for the US, it's a little bit harder to pick, but this might sound a bit of a strange one, but I'm actually going to pick the 1939-1940 design concepts for a cruiser carrier. These being about 12,000 or just over 12,000 ton ships that are either essentially a carrier with a 888-inch turret up front, or in one case has two triples of 6-inch caliber, one fore and one aft. Now you might think, hang on, that's a really silly idea. Kind of. So hopefully you'll see where I'm going with this, because those ships were designed to be somewhat longer, somewhat larger, somewhat heavier displacement than a light cruiser, like, say, a Cleveland. And, of course, the central section, or in the case of the 8-inch ships, the aft and central section, is designed as an aircraft carrier from the start. Just, with a little bit fore, or in one case fore and aft, having some guns. Now, my idea would be, if you got these designs approved, you'd probably maybe, under emergency needs, be laying them down in mid to late 1940, which would then mean that they'd be still under construction, about probably halfway, 2/3 complete by the entry of the US into the World War II, at which point someone could then turn around and, instead of all the faff that was involved with building the Independences, someone would just turn around and say, okay, hang on. Let's just not do the gun thing and just extend that flight deck and maybe the hangar a little bit further. And that way we get a full light fleet carrier really quickly and easily. And then that means that not only does this honestly not an Independence class governor start coming to service a lot sooner and in larger numbers than the historical Independence class did, but they're also somewhat more capable, because a good chunk of the ship is purpose-built as an aircraft carrier from the ground up, and they're slightly larger, which means slightly larger air groups, etc., etc. And that could have been very, very useful in various engagements in 1942-43. John McDonough asks, for all the hype about torpedo boats in the imagination of the world at the turn of the 20th century, they seem to have been remarkably ineffective. I mean, out of 149 torpedo boats between the Russians and the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War, they managed to launch a few dozen torpedoes, mostly already crippled ships, and as far as I can tell, achieved a grand total of 9 hits. Has there ever been a comparable weapon or ship that generated as much smoke with so little fire in the time period the channel covers? And was the torpedo boat mania only possible in the age of mass media? Was this our first example of weapon effectiveness that was determined by press release? Well, I think the press certainly helped the torpedo boat's cause, but there were also various external political factors, like the issues in France that caused the Jeune École to be more favoured, financial issues, political issues surrounding the Franco-Prussian War and so forth. But also there's still a certain amount of cost versus benefit ratio involved, because if you look at a typical Russo-Japanese war torpedo boat, like you mentioned, at that point, even the latest and greatest of them is only displacing around about 150 tons. Now, compare that to the approximately 15,000 tons of what at that point was a modern pre-dreadnought battleship. Obviously, cost-wise, it wouldn't quite work out this way, but displacement-wise, at least, you could theoretically get 100 torpedo boats for the price of a single battleship. Now, as I said, actually paying for 100 torpedo boats would end up costing you more than a single battleship because of the duplication of things like engines and so forth, but you'd still get a lot of torpedo boats. So that would mean for the 149 torpedo boats between the two, collectively, there's probably not been a huge amount spent on them. Cost-wise, if you're interested in around about 1905, it would cost about as much as 28 to 30 torpedo boats to build a single battleship. At which point, since your torpedo boats could be in a lot of different places, it afforded you a lot of harbour defence without being spread out, without having to build battleships and use them in harbour defence. So even if we're, say, using 30, you could have 4 harbours defended by squadrons of torpedo boats for the cost of one battleship, which, of course, if you used it in harbour defence, A, would be a bit of a waste, and B, could only defend one of those harbours. And then if you take them on the offensive, each of them costs so little that even if you lose a bunch of them, one success and suddenly you're in business. You've actually made your money back, essentially. And the temptation of that one cheap thing causing massively outsized damage, and of course if you go into a fleet action with a couple of dozen torpedo boats against half a dozen enemy battleships, you're hoping you're going to get more than just the one hit. I think that's the temptation that keeps everybody going, although obviously the torpedo boat very rapidly evolves into the torpedo gunboat and then the destroyer. Now, in terms of other weapons or ships that generated as much smoke with so little fire, in terms of used quite a lot, but actually with relatively small amounts of success, ironically enough, given the mention of smoke and fire, the fire ship. Of course, we've all heard about fire ships at the Spanish Armada and so forth, but ultimately, if you look at the use of fire ships, and they were in use in large numbers in things like the Anglo-Dutch Wars as well, you had these sort of hodgepodge fire ships like you had at the Armada at Calais, but you also had dedicated fire ships built specifically for the purpose, and you see them all through the Age of Sail, and there's actually quite a lot of them either converted or built, and then most of them employed at one point or another. But for all the fact that they keep cropping up time and time again, a bit like the torpedo boat, they theoretically promise massive results if they can get into contact and do their thing, but the vast majority of them just don't. John McCarthy asks, when did the Allies understand the speed and range of the long-lance torpedo? It's actually a very evolving picture during the Pacific campaign. As early as the first few months of 1942, there were reports, particularly coming out of ABDA Command, that indicated that, hey, the Japanese deck-launched torpedoes are going a heck of a lot faster and a heck of a lot further than any of our torpedoes are, and we should probably be paying attention to this. However, whilst this meant that a certain segment of the Allied naval population, if you like, was at least somewhat aware of what was going on, it wasn't the majority, because the higher-ups, by and large, refused to believe that this could possibly be the case. And, the whole, the inferior yellow person can't possibly develop anything that's as good as our fine Western weapons and all that nonsense, which you see to a disturbing degree in a lot of pre and immediately during initial part of World War II reports. And so, while those reports existed, and the few people who could get their hands on them and had some sense understood that something was up, by and large, the Allied navies didn't know because those reports weren't widely disseminated or believed. Of course, as 1942 ground on, it became harder and harder to ignore, and then with the Guadalcanal campaign, you also started to get examples of long lances coming ashore as a result of various battles, and those could be examined. But of course, even then, although it was clear that this was a very large torpedo and was configured to run particularly quickly, working out that it was powered by oxygen, of course, when it's expended all of that, and it has a bunch of deceptive naming on various components, was a little bit harder. So by the end of 1942, the Allies are beginning to very definitely suspect that actually, even if these things are completely conventionally powered, because of their sheer size and the way their machinery is configured, they must be going faster and further. Apart from anything else, 24-inch torpedo, you can fit more fuel in it. But then, as the situation goes on, both with Guadalcanal and in various other places, they not only manage to get their hands on expended long lances, but also a few that aren't fully or at all expended. And then suddenly it becomes very, very clear in 1943 exactly what this thing is capable of. Captain Oblivious asks, military history is replete with famous quotes. In naval history, for example, there's damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, although that's not exactly what was said. Scratch one flat top, and there's something wrong with our bloody ships today. What are some of your favourite naval quotes, not limited to these examples? And are there any obscure ones that you'd like to share that most probably haven't been heard and probably should be better known? One of my favourite ones actually has relatively little to do with what it's doing and more to do with just the association that bounces around inside my skull. So the reason you got Olympia up here is, of course, you have the relatively famous in US naval circles, at least, quote, "You may fire when ready, Gridley," or words very close to that effect from the Battle of Manila Bay. Now, obviously that has a lot of meaning for the US Navy. For me, though, because I heard that quote after having seen, several years after having seen Star Wars Episode 4 New Hope for the first time, my brain can't help but connect that with, Grand Moff Tarkin, played by Peter Cushing, going, "You may fire when ready, Commander," on the Death Star. And it just keeps transposing Tarkin's tone and delivery onto the order given to poor old Gridley, which at that point, there's also the implication of, unleashing kind of Death Star level firepower in a battle. The whole thing just works and makes it very amusing in my own little head. Another favourite one of mine, partly because it's a pretty awesome quote, but also, again, because of more modern cultural adaptation, is one from Admiral Nelson, who said that a fleet of British ships at war are the best negotiators. Partly because, well, yeah, that's a quote from a position of strength, if ever there was one, but also because, for those of you who play Battlefleet Gothic, the Warhammer 40k Spaceborne model game, in the first edition rulebook, there's a little quote box where someone's just gone, "A fleet of Imperial ships at war are the best negotiators," which, coupled with the awesome artwork, really works. And I think probably my favourite one now is one that I have to paraphrase and also explain the context of, because it doesn't make a huge amount of sense in and of itself without knowing that context. So for those of you who have heard of Admiral Lee, the famous Korean admiral, very successful against Japanese invasions, then because he refused to go on the offensive into an obvious trap, the people that he worked for fired him, put someone else in charge, who sailed into the very obvious trap that Admiral Lee refused to sail into, and unsurprisingly got themselves and the fleet that Admiral Lee had carefully built up mostly destroyed. So they're like, maybe we should have listened to him. Well, I guess we're going to have to get him back. And then everybody's in despair because, well, what had been a fairly promising Korean fleet is now mostly on the bottom of the ocean. And they're basically saying to Yi, "Look, you're a last hope, but honestly, we're not expecting all that much of you. What do you think we should do?" And Yi's response, again, paraphrasing, is kind of, "I've still got a dozen ships." He's only outnumbered about 10 to 1, but he's just like, "Yeah, well, I've got a dozen ships, so I'm sure we'll be fine, and heads out, finds an extra ship on the way, so happy days, and goes off to beat said fleet that outnumbers him 10-1. Robert Henry Ilston asks, would an Age of Sail ship's carpenter have a manual or schematics available to provide him with the direction needed to, for example, build a gun carriage? Generally speaking, no. Ship's carpenters weren't issued with a bunch of paper documentation in the 17th or 18th century and just told, yep, here are plans and specifications for every single thing made out of wood in the ship. Have fun. Now, there were, admittedly, publications that did carry things like basic plans, layouts for gun carriages and so on and so forth, but those weren't the kind of, oh, it's in the ship's library or it's in the ship's carpenter room, have fun. It was, going to be a little bit expensive to get your hands on one, but you could, I suppose. And they would mostly be found in areas that were concerned with, crafting the things in very large numbers. Generally speaking, the ship's carpenter would be working off of potentially plans and notes he's made himself as time goes on. Because remember, as he bounces between various ships, if he starts his career serving in a frigate, then the size and dimensions, etc., for a 6-pounder or a 9-pounder gun are going to be very useful to him on a 6th rate. But on a 1st rate, the only 9-pounder that might be around might be a signalling gun or maybe a chase gun, and then you're going to have 12, 18, 24, 32-pounders. They might look similar carriage-wise, but all the dimensions and strengths, etc., are going to be very, very different. And so he'd be making and modifying notes as he went along. And then, of course, you have all the various permutations of, this is a 32-pounder, but this is also a 32-pounder, but it's 30% the weight and, a couple of feet shorter, and so on and so forth. So you're not going to have multiple volumes of, well, if you're using a 32-pounder that's this weight and this length, you want this gun carriage to this plan, and if it's this length and this other weight, then it's this, but if it's a 24-pounder, then you do this, this, and this. It's going to be much more, I suspect, kind of, oh, you managed to get one of your 24-pounder carriages shot to pieces by an enemy cannon shot. Right, okay, where's the one next to it? Okay, that's 9 inches across, that's 25 inches long, that's 4 inches wide, okay, and right, okay, and we're doing this over here. Now, of course, they might have notes and plans that they themselves have written up, or if they're very lucky, they might have a book or two, but it's going to be a lot more playing it by ear through practical knowledge. And to be fair, you kind of tend to see that even today with master carpenters. A very professional carpenter, I've met a fair number of them, mostly obviously in building trades in my previous career as an engineer. And a master carpenter does not walk around with a small library on his phone or in book form or whatever. Most of the time, if you've got a master carpenter come along and you say, right, I would like a inset cupboard and 2 bookcases on that wall, he'll just break out measuring tape and go, okay, those dimensions, that dimension, that depth, how many shelves do you want on that? Okay, 2 cupboard doors, okay, and then he'll maybe break out a pencil and a scrap of paper, do some sketches, knock up a few dimensions based on what he's measured from the room, and then be like, right, okay, and disappear off and come back later with a bunch of wood that's all been cut to the right shape and size, because it's very much a practical trade. Nosdormu89 asks, I went back recently and watched your engineering favourites and failures video, and you mentioned the obuses. That got me wondering, why weren't howitzers used in naval warfare? Or if they were, can you provide some examples? And were they successful? So, generally speaking, howitzers weren't used in naval warfare in the Age of Sail. They did start to see some use in the latter part of the 19th century and onwards as boat guns. But generally speaking, they're not particularly common in naval use. That's for a number of reasons. Obviously, fundamentally, a howitzer in the time period that, at least most of the time period the channel covers, is a short barrel shell firing gun. And part of that is that, well, the gun barrel walls are too thin to fire a fully solid shot. too much pressure built up behind it. And in those cases, well, the Navy's already got options. If you want to fire a solid shot, you fire a cannon. And if you want to fire something that's nice and lightweight, you fire a carronade. And if you want to fire an explosive shell, then for most of the age of sail, you use a mortar, which is even shorter and therefore, in theory, lighter than a howitzer. Of course, howitzers generally tend to be used in high arc firing anyway, but obviously they don't necessarily have to be, but they are quite short range if you fire them flat, like you can see this howitzer. This is a Dahlgren boat howitzer from the mid-19th century, having been put on a land carriage. So there's not really any need for howitzers. But then when you get to the mid-19th century, then suddenly people are like, well, you know, we need a fairly lightweight gun to go on a ship's boat. And previously that would have been a carronade or a very small long gun. But now there's these explosive shells, and they're thinking, well, you know, explosive shell, disproportionate amount of firepower, but we don't really want to put a mortar in a small ship's boat because that would be silly. They'd never hit anything. And then someone goes, well, you know, on land, they've got these howitzer things that can do short-range direct fire of explosive shells. And then, okay, we have invented the boat howitzer. And suddenly howitzers are in use at sea. And you do see the occasional use of howitzers as ship-to-shore bombardment tools. But for the most part, well, you've still got mortars if you want to fling an explosive shell high in the air. And if you, by the late 19th century, want to fling an explosive shell more directly at somebody, well, that's what the ship's main battery is for. You don't need this sort of weird halfway house going on. A lot of navies will use them in coastal defences because, you know, in a short-range environment where you need to throw a bunch of shells, they can be useful, but not so much at sea. Now, I would say there is one minor caveat to all of this, which is that especially in the mid-19th century, you get these things called shell guns, which are lighter built heavy guns, which sounds a bit like a paradox, but you see where I'm going. You know, they've got a lighter, thinner barrel, and they only fire explosive shells. And up to the, you know, the middle part of the latter half of the 19th century, naval guns generally are relatively short barrel affairs anyway. So you potentially, I suppose, could make an argument that some shell guns of the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s that can only fire explosive shells might qualify as howitzers. But at that point, the only thing I would point out is that they are purely direct fire weapons. They don't have the high angle elevation that most people think of when you think of a howitzer, although obviously it's not strictly a requirement back in those days. So you could make a certain argument that maybe shell guns are a form of howitzer, but that's not how they were perceived at the time. Matt Kidd asks, how did navies determine what the optimal distance between battleships should be in the line of battle, and did different navies come to different conclusions? It very much depends on the time period you're talking about, more so than the navy in question, because in the Age of Sail, the distance between capital ships in the line of battle was entirely situational. So in absolute ideal spherical cow in a vacuum circumstances, you'd want the ships to be so close that the bowsprit of one could touch the stern lantern of the ship in front of it. And that's for a number of reasons. It made communication a lot easier, as a minor point, but it would also mean that you could concentrate as much firepower as possible into a smaller space as possible, and it would make it almost impossible for the enemy to get through your line. But, of course, different ships sail at different rates. The wind varies in strength, speed, and direction across a battlefield, and how well ships control can vary quite a bit as well. And of course, battle damage, some ships might end up moving faster than others as various bits of their rigging and sails are shot away at different rates. And so in any given situation, depending on which ships are doing what, you know, how capable each of those ships are, what direction they are facing the wind, what the weather's doing, how far apart you should be spaced will vary, not just on a battle-by-battle basis, but even on a situation-by-situation basis. For example, at the Battle of Trafalgar, The redoutable has the idea of sticking very close to Bucentaux's stern, because they don't want the British to break through. Bucentaur, however, takes one look at this situation and basically goes, "This is stupid, redoutable, you're far too close, you're probably going to knock a hole in my stern, back off." Captain Lucas does so, and then not too long after that they go, "Oh, here comes victory, quick, close up, close the gap," and it's too late. Oh, they've gone through. Well, that was annoying. Now, once you get into the age of, well, not so much the age of iron and steel, more so the age of steam, when you can much more finely regulate your speed, and then you move into the age of fully iron and steel, where you've got big guns firing massive amounts of explosive shells at each other. Now the distance between ships becomes regulated by a few different things. You don't have to worry so much about the difference in speed, because it's much easier to regulate the speed of ships. But as the ships get bigger, you now have to think about maneuvering. So if something happens to the ship ahead of you, are you going to have the time and the distance to maneuver around them? Or are you just going to ram into them? So obviously that might necessitate a bigger gap. But also, as you've got big, powerful, armor-piercing explosive shells being flung around, but the area in which they're most likely to land covers a oval that is considerably larger and normally than the ship that's being targeted, it's also suddenly a bad idea to have a ship too close to the one in front of it, because then a stray round that missed its intended target might hit you. So, and obviously as ships get bigger and faster and have more inertia, this spacing starts to get larger and larger for obvious reasons. And so again, it becomes somewhat situational. Not as situational as in the Age of Sail, and there are various regulations that suggest at certain speeds and in certain environments perhaps certain specific distances should be maintained. And those distances do have to be maintained once they're decided upon through most of the fleet, because that allows interchangeability of formations. It allows you to sail in specific columns and know that simultaneous maneuvers will end up in a specific new formation, rather than, one column being really bunched up, another column being really spread out, and it ending up all over the place. But while there are, certainly by the early 20th century, suggestions of, well, maybe you should be this many feet or meters apart, even then it's still down to quite a lot of on-the-spot decision-making by the admiral or captain in question. Sebastian asks, the US and some other Allied forces celebrated the crossing of the equator with shellback and other initiations. Did Axis navies or any other navies follow the same tradition? Now, this isn't an area that I know a huge amount about, to be perfectly honest, but from what I've been able to work out, it seems that the whole sort of King Neptune and shellbacks and various other initiation ceremonies seem to be a Northern European thing. I can certainly find evidence that British, French, and German ships and other nations in that general area have had some form of this kind of ceremony going back hundreds and hundreds of years. And of course, that meant the US was founded with those in the mind of its sailors. But once you get much beyond North and Northwestern Europe, either there just isn't a tradition of such things, and obviously the further afield you go to places like Japan, and what there is, if anything, is a much later sort of copying of that Northwestern European idea. So, for example, there are records of Japanese ships holding such ceremonies in the early 20th century, but when you look at them, they basically just copied British or American tradition. There doesn't seem to have been any intrinsic Japanese idea of crossing the equator line ceremonies before they looked around and saw other people doing it and thought, hey, that's cool, we'll try it ourselves. And similarly, the sort of the more Mediterranean European powers, Spain, Italy, etc., at least as far as I can tell, don't seem to have their own specific big crossing traditions the way that some of the Northwestern European powers do. GFDX asks, if the High Seas Fleet had sailed out in 1918 and the end result of the ensuing battle was, roughly speaking, what your video on the fictional Battle of Texel says, i.e. most of the High Seas Fleet is sunk, but with several British and American ships permanently out of action as well, what ramifications would this have for the Washington Naval Treaty? Several battleships that historically were kept are now severely damaged or outright sunk, Barham, Florida, the Courageous class, etc., while Japan and the others still have theirs all fresh. Would the remaining surrendered German battleships form some of their replacements? I mean, obviously it depends exactly which ships we're talking about, but assuming that at least some of the more modern ships have been sunk or destroyed on the Allied side of things, I actually don't think that you would have German ships being brought in after the German surrender, obviously, and then being used as replacements. Because, especially if you're looking at it from a Washington Naval Treaty perspective, some of the older ships, so basically 12-inch ships for the most part, although the Americans obviously did retain a few 12-inch ships in the historical Washington Naval Treaty, but more broadly speaking, 12-inch ships, and actually in the British case some 13.5-inch ships, lost during said battle. Well, in the historic Washington Treaty they went away anyway, so that doesn't make much odds. It's, for the British, the middle and later period 13.5-inch ships and the 15-inch ships that they need to worry about. And for the Americans, that'll be obviously their 14-inch ships, because that's all they would have had in service at that point. The Colorado's being built later on, and some of their later 12-inch ships. Now, for those that are either too badly damaged to be worth repairing, or have been sunk, or are otherwise out of action in a very permanent way, like having run aground on the Dutch coast, then yes, obviously that takes them away from the historical Washington Treaty, but I think what would happen is that if you lose any of your relatively modern ships, there would be an immediate call for the construction of replacements. And bear in mind, the Washington Naval Treaty is an early 1920s thing. So if you've got a battle in late 1918, then whereas obviously with the British historically, the only thing of any substantial interest they lay down in the mid to late part of the 1910s capital ship-wise is the Admiral class. In this case, not only are the Admiral class almost certainly going to be expedited in construction rather than paused, because yes, they might not be perfect, but it's better than nothing to replace some of the more modern ships that have been lost. But both the US and the British have been keeping up sort of sketch designs and so forth just in case, so they would probably very rapidly finalise whatever their latest sketch design was and lay down at least a class or so, maybe more, to make good the various losses. And when you look at the timeline, so if they're, let's say design finalised, laid down by early 1919, you might think, oh, at the end of the war they'll be cancelled, but remember, these are making good pre-existing losses, so they're more likely, if the sort of older classes have been badly cut down by losses, they're more likely to just scrap those ships earlier. And so 1919, 1920, going into 21, these ships will have been launched and will be fitting out, and by that point you've invested far too much money in them to really allow them to be scrapped. So when the Washington Treaty comes around, those plus maybe a few other ships like the Colorados in the States and the Nelsons, which obviously will be generated afterwards, which will be the leading ships, those will be in the treaty and essentially taking the place in large part of some of those older ships. And of course they're going to be larger and displace more. So if the Washington Treaty is still vaguely similar tonnage levels to what the historic treaty allows, they're going to take up proportionally more of that tonnage. And the British and American navies may not see that as any bad thing, because for the Americans, for example, it might actually give them an excuse to completely get rid of the 12-inch armed ships out of frontline duties entirely, and then just have 14 and 16-inch armed ships. And for the British, I don't think they're going to take anywhere near enough losses to justify getting rid of every single 13.5-inch ship offhand. But they might, if they've got half a dozen or so 15-inch ships building, maybe even more, because if they've got the other three Admiral class probably in service by that point, plus let's say another 4 to 6 ships under construction and, well, in the process of being fitted out, they might well still make an argument because the Colorados have 16-inch guns that they should get the Nelsons, but they might get rid of any surviving Orions and 13.5-inch King George V's and maybe just keep Tiger and the Iron Dukes around, much the way they kept the King George V's around historically, until Nelson and Rodney come into service, and then they scrap them, which would leave the British entirely with a 15 and 16-inch armed fleet. Glenn Ricafrente asks, could you please discuss the French follow-up heavy cruiser designs after the Algerie? So in terms of the immediate follow-up heavy cruiser designs to Algerie in the Marine Nationale, that basically comes in one of two flavours. There was the still technically treaty compliant, just C5 design, which was essentially, let's use Algerie as our base, except instead of 4 twin 8-inch, we're going to go with 3 triple 8-inch, so you actually get an extra gun but minus 1 turret. And the interesting thing about that was that the secondary battery, which primarily heavy anti-aircraft guns in twin 100mm mounts, you actually had 10 of them, but arranged in a very interesting way. So you had 2 waist mounts somewhat forward, obviously after the main battery up front, fairly standard, but then where you would have had the super-firing aft turret if this was a 4-turret design, like an Algerie with twin turrets, there you had a 3 twin-mount layout of the 100mm, which in some ways was similar to the secondary setup on the French battleships, the Dunkirks and the Richelieus. Now, the reason I say that's quite interesting is because the centre line aftmost of the 3 was actually higher than the other 2. And the other 2 weren't quite wing mounts. They were sort of in a triangle shape. So the other 2, they obviously weren't centre line, but they also weren't all the way out on the wings. And they were actually somewhat lower than the aftmost mount, which was a centre line one. So that meant that with 5 mounts, you got 10 guns, and 3 of those mounts, so 6 guns, could easily come to bear on either broadside. But because of the way it was set out, in theory, if you were firing at relatively close-in high-altitude aircraft, you could bring all 3 of the aft mounts to bear, and at certain angles, even firing slightly forward, obviously not fully forward, but somewhat, you could also bring those 3 mounts to bear. So in theory, you could bring 8 of your 10 guns to bear on one side or the other at certain altitudes and elevations, which was quite handy. There was also a version of the C5 design which had 12 100mm mounts, so you added another pair of twin mounts on the wings, almost dead amidships, but they did that by eliminating the amidships aircraft handling facilities. And so obviously you didn't have those, but you had more heavy AA and also some 37mm light AA as well. Obviously the C5 version had that as well. And the C5 design loosely is in World of Warships, as you can see, as the Charles Martel. And then that evolved into another design, which just about scrapes in as a direct Algerie successor pre-World War II, which most people vaguely call the Saint Louis class. And indeed, again, it is in World of Warships as the Saint Louis. Now, that also has 9 8-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, so very much like the C5, but it is a slightly larger ship because it moves beyond the weight restrictions of the treaty system, so it's about 14.5 to 15,000 tons. And what you get for that? Well, you get some more anti-aircraft guns. You also get slightly higher speed because it's got a much bigger power plant, obviously partly to move the larger displacement, but also that does make it a little bit of a faster vessel. And as for armour, in theory it should have somewhat better armour, but at least from the sources I was able to consult, the exact armour thickness and also the exact armour layout were still under discussion when war broke out and the whole thing went by the wayside. Now, there are some further reports of, in the early part of the actual Second World War, the Marine Nationale looking at various sketch or paper designs for even larger heavy cruisers, but those are therefore successors to the C5 and Saint Louis types, rather than direct successors of the Algerie. DM Phoenix asks, a typical World War I era dreadnought had a crew complement of up to 1,000 officers and men. However, by World War II, a typical fast battleship had doubled or potentially even tripled that number, with Iowa and Yamato embarking over 2,700 men. Even cruisers of the Alaska class had crews of over 1,500 men by that point. Considering that advancing technology eliminated some roles entirely, coal stokers for example, what accounts for this dramatic increase in manpower requirements? It can't all have been anti-aircraft gunners and radar operators, could it? Not all, but they do make up a good chunk of it. Now, of course, with Iowa and Yamato, they are also considerably larger ships. They displace more, their dimensions are more, therefore there's going to be more systems, and each system is going to need more men compared to a 25, 30, 35,000 ton World War I era vessel. But a good chunk of it is actually the anti-aircraft guns. So, for example, if you look at a typical World War I super dreadnought that makes it past the end of the war, so Queen Elizabeth, for example, notionally, going into the war, that is World War I, a Queen Elizabeth class would have a crew of 850 to 950 men. By the early 20s, that number has crept up to 1,150 to 1,200 men. And that's basically purely with the addition of a relatively small number of anti-aircraft guns and aircraft. Now, of course, it's not that those 300 or so men are going to be purely the AA gunners and the aircrew, but they're going to make up a large chunk of it, because you've got to remember, for every anti-aircraft gun, you've got to have an anti-aircraft gun crew, and then depending on how many watches you're going to be standing on the ship, you double, triple, perhaps or more that number of men. Because if, let's say, for sake of argument, you have an AA gun that needs a 6-man crew, well, you can't have that 6-man crew on duty 24/7. So if you have a 3-watch system, so essentially that equates to 1 watch is on duty, 1 watch is sleeping, and 1 watch is doing other stuff like, eating and so forth, then you're looking at that 6-man crew suddenly becoming an 18-man crew that you've got to look for. And if you've only got 4 such guns, so let's say you've got 4 3-inch high-angle guns, and each of them has 18 men that you need to assign to them, now all of a sudden you've added 72 men to your complement. And not just that, because now you've got to find mess space for them, and you've got to find food, and potentially if you're going to put 72, so if you've got, let's say, 850, 900 men, if you're adding 7, 8, 9% to your crew, something along those lines, depending obviously on exactly how many men per gun you've got, then you're going to need maybe an additional washer or 2, a couple of additional catering staff in the messes, a few officers to oversee it all, etc. And now you probably actually increased crew numbers by around about 100 people, just for having those 4 AA guns. And obviously, then the flight crew, the pilot, observer, potentially if you have one, perhaps multiple if you have multiple aircraft, and all the other air crew and people associated with the air crew, that's going to add up. And then when you look at the various refits that are going on, it's not just the radar, you've also got things like increased numbers of searchlights, potentially a sonar or ASDIC operator if that particular battleship has one. And yes, you are saving your crew complement slightly by, in sort of refitted cases, reducing the number of casement guns, but you tend to add a lot more guns than you take away. So, for example, after a bit of fiddling around with the more washed out mountings, a Queen Elizabeth class has around about a dozen 6-inch guns in single casemates, whereas a fully refitted one like QE or Valiant will have 20 4.5-inch guns in those twin rotating turrets. Now, when you get to World War II, obviously you factor in radar, and not just there's a radar, you've got radar crew for your surface search radar, your air search radar, your gunnery control radar, your secondary anti-aircraft gunnery control radar, your IFF potentially, perhaps more in, although it'll be a slightly small increase, but more increase in your radio communications staff, and it all starts to add up. Although the single biggest cause of jumps in World War II era battleships is pretty much down to the AA men, because obviously, as we said before, a 6-man crew per gun on some heavy anti-aircraft guns can increase your crew numbers by a fair amount. Now, if you're taking 20 mils or 40 mils, now obviously each individual gun mount isn't necessarily going to need as many crewmen as our hypothetical one, but there's a huge number more of those gun mounts, and so the numbers still go up quite quickly. And if you want an idea of just how many that can add, well, look at the crew complement of the Iowa class in World War II, when they're absolutely smothered with light and medium anti-aircraft guns, and compare that with the crew complement in the 1980s, when they're reactivated for the final time, and their complement has actually dropped. As you said, they've got about 2,700 in World War II, maybe a bit more. But by the time of the Gulf War, at the end of the 80s, start of the 90s, they've lost about 1,000 men. Now, granted, yes, they've also lost 4 of their 5-inch 38 mounts, but they've gained Tomahawks, harpoons, and drones at the back. So, at the very minimum, that's evening things out. So, well over a third of the crew of the Iowas are purely light and medium anti-aircraft gunners. A.B. Coates asks, you mentioned in your video that Admiral Lee cheated on his eye test. How easy was it to cheat on US Navy officer exams, and what would the consequences have been if he was caught? I mean, it depends which officer's exams. If you're talking about, handwritten exams, that's obviously relatively difficult to cheat on, because those tend to be done either in isolation or far enough away from other people that you can't really crib their answers. And also the answers have to be somewhat individual. If you're asked, what is your approach to this tactical problem, and 2 people submit identical answers, it's going to be very suspicious and very obvious that someone's been copying someone else. Then you have exams that are basically almost impossible to cheat without bribing someone outright. So, for example, if you have to pass a physical fitness exam, and someone says, right, we need you to run, let's say 5 miles in a certain amount of time or less, well, either you are going to run that in that amount of time or less, and the course is going to be fairly well monitored, fairly well known, fairly well managed. So yeah, unless you can pay a really good lookalike or pay someone to, shave 10-15 seconds off their stopwatch or something, that's going to be a very difficult one to cheat. But the one that Admiral Lee cheated on, his eye test, that, as it turns out, as long as you have a decent memory, is pretty easy. Now, of course, you have to have that decent memory in the first place, and what Admiral Lee did is take advantage of the fact that, well, back in those days, you had to have a physical thing, and it was relatively expensive to produce. Of course, these days, if you want to have an eye exam in the military, and the military doesn't want people to cheat on it, they can have, 4 dozen randomized printed plastic boards with different characters and in different orders. Or they could just have a digital screen with ever-changing combinations of and sizes of letters on them. But back in those days, that's not really an option. So you would just have, here is your probably enamel metal plate with the various letters on it in varying sizes, but obviously in a fixed array. And what Lee did was basically bribe-pressure a bunch of his mates or other people who could be sufficiently bought, who are going through the exam ahead of him, to just tell him what those letters were, at which point he memorized them. Now that's where it's perhaps slightly more difficult, but if you've got a good head for memory, you memorize exactly what the combination is, keep that in your mind, and then when someone points to something that honestly you can't actually see, then Lee just goes, okay, hang on a minute, I can see that's the second row, third letter in, and I remember that was a Y. So then he'll say, oh, that's a Y, and then, well, clearly he can see that. Okay, fine, carry on. Now, if it was somehow discovered that he had been cheating the eye exam, then, well, in peacetime, the most normal procedure would be, okay, you're going to go back and retest that because it's an eye exam. It doesn't say anything much about your military competence, but, let's just see if we've got proof, because the easiest way to prove were you cheating an eye exam is make you test it, take it again, and if you fail it this time without any ability to prepare or crib off what other people have seen, then it's fairly obvious you have cheated. If he then fails his eye exam, then of course he can't continue in his chosen career. Michael Gilson asks, if the concept of the continuous rod warhead had been thought of in the interwar years, would it have been more or less effective than the anti-aircraft shells used during World War II? Now, of course, this being a post-World War II weapons development, it's not something I'm as familiar with as the bread and butter of the channel, so for those of you who are more familiar with this kind of weapon or warhead, forgive me if I get anything a little bit wrong, and feel free to correct in the comments. But as far as I understand it, as you can kind of see from this picture, the point of a continuous rod warhead is that you essentially get this disc of death that is much more likely to tear a target apart than being hit by an individual fragment or bit of an exploding shell. So theoretically that's good. However, in the World War II context, I actually think this would have been less effective. Now, allow me to explain. The reason I think this is because, as far as I can tell, by being kind of a ring of death, what this means is that when that warhead explodes, there will be, for all intents and purposes, a disc, and if your aircraft happens to be on that line of the disc when the warhead detonates, or shortly thereafter, and you fly through it, you are very dead. Now, obviously, that's a good thing for the defender. However, if you are considerably ahead or behind that disc, i.e. it's detonated too far in front of you, or it's detonated behind you, or perhaps it's detonated right next to you, but you just happen to fly past before the expanding disc gets to you, then you're going to be almost unscathed, apart from potentially the shockwave and some minor shrapnel. And you can possibly see where I'm going with this. It was in World War II, getting the kind of, this warhead has detonated just a little bit ahead of you, so that by the time the expanding continuous rod reaches an intersection with your flight path, you are in position to be cut in half. That's not going to happen with World War II AA shells. You could argue maybe with VT shells it would become more likely, but it's still, I would say, perhaps a little bit on the less likely side than the likely side as compared to the much more advanced fuses and proximity sensors that you have in Cold War era anti-aircraft ammunition, and guns and missiles for that matter. Whereas while an individual piece of shrapnel from, let's say, a 5-inch 38 guns shell, an individual bit of that shell hitting your aircraft might be somewhat less likely to take it out in the average circumstance than the ring of death from a continuous rod projectile. The fact is that because the shell is basically just exploding, I mean, obviously between the shape of the shell, the shape of the internal explosive, and the speed of travel in one direction, you are going to get something of a non-spherical spray of debris, but you are getting, for all intents and purposes, roughly speaking, a 360-degree spray of fragments, which is a lot more forgiving of small inaccuracies, because then if the shell detonates slightly to the side, above, below, or even behind a target, as long as the rate of the speed of flight of those projectile fragments is greater than the aircraft that's targeting, there's still a chance that even a shell that detonates behind you might actually pepper you with some shell fragments. Now, as we said, of course, those shell fragments may not put the aircraft down, but they'll do something, and something is better than nothing. So in the World War II context, I think the omnidirectional shrapnel warheads were probably statistically more likely to actually hit something. ACC asks, sails deform and stretch out in the sun and wind over time, impacting performance. even if the deformation is not too obvious from a purely visual standpoint. During the Age of Sail, how much emphasis was put on keeping new rigging available, and how often were the sails on warships fully replaced? Now, yes, I know this is a latter part of the 19th century ship, but it is actually a good example of a ship under full sail. So, anyway, how often were sails on warships fully replaced? Not that often. They would keep spare sails, but those spare sails were to replace ones that were badly damaged or destroyed in battle or in particularly rough weather. Now, you've got to remember, of course, they don't want the sails to be too heavy, because that's just not good for performance and all sorts of other things. But warship sails in the Age of Sail were generally somewhat heavier in terms, and therefore more durable in terms of material, than a lot of modern sails. Because a lot of modern sails, there's more emphasis on lightweight and therefore better performance. On an Age of Sail vessel, which might be away from port for months or years at a time, you can't afford to have the absolute epitome of lightweight performance sails, which will then stretch, rip, tear, and be blown out every few weeks, because you'll run out of replacement sails before you're even a quarter of the way into your mission. Plus, of course, there's also the durability issue of, well, there's going to be at least fragments flying around in battle. You don't want something that's going to immediately open itself up like a can under a particularly vicious can opener. So, as I said, while they're not deliberately overdoing the sails to the point they're too heavy that people can't move them, because that's another factor involved, can your sailors actually shift the blasted things? Age of Sail ships' sails will tend to be somewhat tougher material than in terms of sheer durability. Even if the canvas itself on a per gram or per ounce basis isn't as durable, there's just a lot more of it. So you wouldn't need to replace the sails as often. If they did rip, you could repair them, stitch them together, etc. And if they stretched a little bit, you had so much rigging on them that as long as the stretching wasn't so much as to compromise their ability to catch the wind, you could just tighten a few ropes up here and there and still have them under the correct amount of tension. Now, as far as rigging is concerned, of course, rigging you might have to replace a little bit more often. Ropes get damaged, ropes get rotten, all sorts of things happen to them. And yes, down below the waterline there would be a rope locker, which was often a very large portion of whichever deck it was on a ship, where there'd be all sorts of different lengths of rope that could then be spliced in, replaced, etc., etc. But, of course, again, there is a finite supply, and you are probably going to be out at sea for a very long time. So when it comes to rigging, you would have plenty of, certainly by the late Age of Sail, plenty of pulley blocks and various lengths of rope and cord and so forth, which are available for you to put in place of stuff that has begun to decay or has snapped, etc. But once more, it's not a case of, oh, well, we've had these rigging lines up for 6 months, I guess we're just going to replace the whole lot. It would be a case of, a little bit of tensioning here, a bit of replacement there, and as long as they are broadly functional, then you're going to keep them that way unless and until they become either dangerous or not functional in the slightest, to preserve the relatively minimal amount of supplies you have on board. And this, along with a whole multitude of other factors, could be why a ship that's fresh out of port might sail a lot faster than it did when it came into port 2 months earlier. Fool in a Hat asks, what happens to a torpedo that misses, if assuming it runs until its fuel has run out, but then did they have a self-destruct? Did they float around like a particularly dodgy mine? Did they sink? And if they did sink, did they eventually, over enough deep water, hit a depth where they'd implode, or is the bottom of the sea littered with old torpedoes more or less intact? Well, the simple answer is yes. All of those things are possible. So a torpedo that's expended all of its fuel in a run could do one of many, many things. It might have a self-destruct on board. Some torpedoes, especially in World War II, certainly did have this feature, and it even worked on occasion. So potentially, torpedo would reach the end of its run and then just go boom. However, there are a fair amount of torpedoes that in World War I, World War II that didn't have that feature, or where that feature has malfunctioned. As you can see, this Japanese torpedo fetched up on a beach. Now, in terms of flotation, is the thing going to sink when it runs out of fuel or float? Again, depends on the build of the torpedo. There's a few different features. One of its self-destruct devices might just be to flood everything. But you've got to remember that while a warhead does obviously have a certain amount of mass, and ideally torpedoes should be at least slightly negatively buoyant in order to keep them from porpoising. While the overall torpedo launch is negatively buoyant, as it burns through its fuel and also its compressed air, those tanks are going to be empty or emptied. And that in turn means that the overall buoyancy level of the torpedo might have gone up. Again, as part of the self-destruct system, once those are completely and utterly empty, there may be some feature to allow water to be admitted to them. But assuming that there isn't, it's a case of, well, is the extra buoyancy afforded by the now empty voids of those tanks enough to overcome the general negative buoyancy of the torpedo and make it float? If so, then it'll float. If not, then it won't. So proportional to the overall torpedo volume, how much space do your air or oxygen and fuel tanks occupy? And also, how close to being buoyant was your torpedo when it was launched? So in some cases, it might float, and in other cases, it might sink, depending on what the torpedo is and all of the measures we just mentioned before. Now, if they do sink, most of the time, a torpedo hitting a relatively soft ocean bed isn't going to be hitting hard enough to set off any kind of contact fuse that they happen to have on board, although it could happen. But as to what would happen generally, if a torpedo sinks far enough down into the depths, it would implode, because as I said, you would have things like your empty fuel tanks. Those will certainly be very sensitive to implosion. The warhead will eventually get to a depth that it could implode. Various other systems on board, again, that can't necessarily resist depression, the really, really deep ocean. But there is quite a margin, certainly in shallower waters, where a torpedo that's sinking and doesn't have a self-destruct and just lands on the seabed might not have reached anything close to its crush depth. And at that point, yes, then there are, in certain areas, there are going to be little shoals of old torpedoes that have just fetched up on the seabed and aren't really doing all that much while they quietly decay. Mark Griffiths asks, mildly inspired by We Have Ways of Making You Talk's A Picture Paints 1,000 Word specials, what are your favourite images that define the essences of the big navies from World War II? Could be a painting, a photo, a propaganda image, really anything that says to you, this encapsulates that navy perfectly. Now, as with things like what's your favourite ship and so forth, these kind of pictures rotate through my head at varying points as I just come across new pictures or I'm reminded of other pictures. But if we're looking for World War II, for the US, I think for me, it's a toss-up between two pictures. One, very obviously, this one. This is a really famous photo, and for very, very good reason. A very good representation of the US Navy, or at least a certain aspect of it, in the Second World War. But for those of you who are carrier-minded, I'm not actually going to go for Murderer's Row at Ulithi, although that would be a very good candidate. I'm actually going to go for, well, at the moment, this one, but there's a whole bunch of other similar pictures from this set. And this is Task Force 38, along with, obviously, the elements of the British Pacific Fleet, but mostly Task Force 38 in these pictures, doing specifically choreographed maneuvers in late August 1945. And not only do I think this encapsulates the late US Navy, or late war US Navy, perfectly because of the sheer number of carriers on display here, but also because this entire thing is basically one gigantic flex, considering that at this point the Japanese still haven't signed the official surrender document. And a few days earlier, they'd put a torpedo into the Pennsylvania, which ironically enough was in the other picture. But yeah, when you're doing this kind of stunt off the enemy coast, you're kind of exerting dominance in a big way. Now, unfortunately, some of the best photos that encapsulate the Royal Navy for me were taken just prior to World War II. So if we're going to limit ourselves to what I believe are World War II period photos, then one of the best photos of the Royal Navy, and yes, there's obviously the famous shot looking down the line of carriers and so forth during one of the Mediterranean convoys, and there's the British own version of Murderers Row in the Pacific, but one of the ones I really like for the British is this series of various Royal Navy cruisers in roughly line abreast, and there's a similar one involving Glasgow and one other cruiser kind of going in kind of the opposite direction, but I think these, for some reason, just encapsulate the Royal Navy to me in the period. Reva's Rambling Recess asks, given that hardwood was preferred for building age-of-sail ships, especially warships, how much of the Royal Navy and its colonial possessions' existence was a circular economy? Could the Royal Navy have managed with just the hardwoods available from the home isles and their allies if they didn't have the duty to protect far-flung outposts of empire? Was it a spiral where the need to provide various duty stations with ships then required still more timber for those ships? I seem to recall you mentioning India-built ships being made mostly from teak, and I'm aware of Cowrie from New Zealand being approved for masts. If you're looking at a ship as a whole thing, from the very tippity top of the mast to the lower part of the keel, theoretically, a Royal Navy that was tasked purely with defending the home isles, and therefore a British existence without an empire, could have managed with local and localish available supplies. Britain certainly contained the right kinds of wood and enough of it, at least for the most part, to build the hulls of ships. Your keels, your frames, your planking, decking, etc., etc. Where the British Isles in particular fell down was supplying good mast timber. Ideally, the kind of timber that made for the best masts tended to come from places like the northern US, Canada, and Sweden. Now, of course, you could trade with Sweden, which they did quite a lot, but that came with several potential vulnerabilities. Of course, Sweden might choose not to trade with you for whatever reason, but also other countries that controlled the access to the trade routes between you and Sweden might try and stop you acquiring mast timber for fairly obvious reasons. Now, you could make do with locally supplied stuff. That's how a lot of medieval and early age of sail British ships were supplied, but it's not the best. And if you want a really good warship, then you want the best. And in fact, pretty much all age of sail nations had this kind of problem, unless you had an extremely long country when it came to going north to south, which was basically places like the States, and that was almost it. The ranges of environment that you needed to grow both nice, tall, springy timbers for masts and good, strong, long-growth, heavy timbers for your hull and framework, those are kind of mutually exclusive environmental conditions. Now, you could get some real freaks of nature, relatively compact countries that had all sorts of weird and wonderful terrain that would get you some of that, but there's very, very limited places where a country is big enough not only to have all that varied terrain and varied climate, but also have it in sufficient quantities for mass-scale shipbuilding. And of course, bear in mind the British Isles did kind of run out of ship-scale timber several times over its history, and then have to, crash regrow forests while importing timber from elsewhere. So yes, in theory, if the Royal Navy had basically been the British Maritime Coastal Defence Force for the whole of its history, then in theory they could just about have put together a fleet out of the wood that they had to hand. But more realistically, if they wanted that fleet to be kind of competitive with everybody else, that meant at the very minimum you had to trade with other people, and that with that trade comes risks, so it might be better to find a source that you actually fully controlled. Then at least you've just got to worry about getting said timber from point A to point B, rather than worrying whether point A will sell it to you at all. But then, of course, you need more ships to defend that trade route, and so you need even more access to wood, and off you go, and all of a sudden there's an empire. I'm not saying the British Empire was built on the need for ship timber, but you kind of see where I'm going with that. Now, when it comes to places like India-built ships being made from teak, yes, that's absolutely a thing, and in part that's just because, well, if you have need for a ship in India or off India in Indian waters, and you have shipyards that can do it in India, it's probably cheaper and quicker just to build the ship there than it is to get a bunch of money, send it all the way across the planet to home, get then a ship built at home, and then have that ship sent all the way back over to India with a crew. It's just going to be easier, faster, and cheaper to build local. And if you're building local, that means building with local wood. Sapper Ninja asks, was there ever a point in history where one navy could conceivably fight all the other navies in the world? Perhaps the US Navy around 1945, or the Royal Navy at the peak of its power? In theory, yes, there are a few points in history, although the success rate is going to depend partly on what exactly the scenario is that's involved here. Are we talking about, let's say, on a certain day, everybody decides to fight that navy, despite the fact that navy might be scattered across all sorts of parts of the planet? Are we talking about, taking all the ships from one navy, all the ships from everyone else's navies, lining them up in the naval equivalent of a sandbox and letting them have at each other? Is it something that this navy has planned? They're like, we're going to fight everybody, so we're going to position ourselves to do so. What's going on? But in very, very broad terms, if you're just looking at on-paper stats, then in theory, the US Navy at the end of World War II could fight all the other navies in the world, largely on the basis of the fact that by the end of World War II, the sum total of all the other navies in the world mostly consists of the Royal Navy, because, the Royal Navy and the US Navy have just done a very good job of making sure there isn't much of a Kriegsmarine or an Imperial Japanese Navy left. Now, there are obviously some Italian ships. The Regia Marina still around. There's a handful of German and Japanese ships around. The Soviets have a navy, mostly, to be honest, by the 1945 time period, its main strength is submarines, and they're mostly short range in the Baltic and so forth. And then pretty much everybody else outside of that is very, very small. So, and then obviously add up carrier numbers, battleship numbers, cruiser numbers, destroyer numbers. Yeah, it'll be a hell of a fight, but the US Navy does have the material advantage to win that fight. Now, dial things back a little bit further, and for example, if you were to look at the first part of the 19th century, particularly towards the end of the Napoleonic Wars or going into the 1820s, 1830s, then the Royal Navy could quite conceivably fight everybody else in the world, because by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Spanish Navy has been really wrung out by the ongoing couple of decades of conflict. The French Navy has been somewhat reduced, and while there are various other navies in existence, the Russians, for instance, a lot of other navies, like the Danes, the Dutch, etc., have also seen their numbers reduced, either by siding with the wrong side, as it turns out, or just through attrition and economic issues. And when you go further back through the Age of Sail, especially in the 17th century, and to the late 17th and certainly through a lot of the 18th century, you tend to see that the Royal Navy very often was fighting almost everybody else in the world anyway, although there were occasionally allies with them as well. Particularly the latter half of the 1700s, the latter half of the 18th century is where I'd say that's when the Royal Navy would be capable of fighting pretty much everybody who mattered. The Outer Circle asks, at what point did PPE as we know it creep in? That's personal protective equipment. Obviously in the Age of Sail, a little cotton in the ears consisted of your PPE, but gloves, flash protection, etc. was clearly in place by World War I. So when and how did the transition occur? Well, it depends how you define naval PPE. So even in the Age of Sail, technically there are forms of personal protective equipment, because when you look at the requirements for how to operate in a magazine, there are certain things that you aren't allowed to wear, and therefore also certain things you are expected to wear in order to reduce the risk of sparks and so forth in the magazines. Now, obviously, those regulations are not PPE in the traditional sense of here is this specific thing that you will wear that protects you from things. It's more about not wearing things that will cause an immediate danger to the ship. But technically, that is a form of personal protective equipment to a certain degree. Now, where you start to see what you might classify as like true naval PPE, i.e. things like anti-flash hoods and gloves and suits and so forth, that all really kicks off during World War One. There are some experiments being done in the immediate run-up to World War One by various nations. However, you've got to remember that navies have gone from black powder weapons, which are a fairly known quantity. The safety regulations, such as they are for that, have been in place for literally hundreds of years, through gun cotton and nitrocellulose and various other forms of both propellant and explosive, and the commensurate increase in both gun firepower and potential different volatility issues in the space of around about 2 decades by the time of World War One, potentially slightly less depending on which particular technology you're looking at. And having gone through multiple stages during that period, there really hadn't been the time to sit down and go, okay, what are the actual additional risks brought about by these things, and do we need to make changes? Apart from anything, obviously, people believed that new propellants, like cordite in the Royal Navy's case, were actually far more stable and far less dangerous than black powder, and therefore, if anything, the protective measures that were required in older ships weren't as necessary in newer ships. And yes, obviously there had been the Russo-Japanese War and the Battle of Tsushima and other associated battles, but even then, most of the damage had been done by explosions and more conventional fire rather than the kind of very rapid high-temperature flashes that you would, wear anti-flash gear to guard against. And of course, with World War One, you also had the advent of poison gas on land, which led to the development of stuff like this, which is an anti-gas suit for the Royal Navy in the immediate aftermath of World War One. And so it's only really when World War One itself kicks off and you start to have large-scale combats with people using all these modern explosives and propellants, and a large body of evidence very quickly building up about the dangers of flash and fumes and so forth, that you see a rather rapid development of various forms of personal protective gear, which obviously percolates through lots of different navies fairly quickly. So often people are like, oh yes, well, the Royal Navy introduced anti-flash gear after Jutland. Well, yes, but they weren't unique in World War One in introducing that stuff. I mean, there's the honestly, we're not knockoff extras from the Doctor Who set PPE from the Austro-Hungarian Navy. And look that up. Look up Austro-Hungarian Navy PPE if you want a good laugh. And that obviously comes about relatively quickly because the Austro-Hungarian Navy ceases to exist at the end of World War One. So they're moving pretty sharp on this issue as well. Andrew Dederer asks, what was the British establishment and Royal Navy's reactions to the influence of sea power upon history? Was it, oh, that's obvious, and a collective kind of, or were there questions raised as to why no one in naval circles had seemed inclined to this kind of introspection? Well, as you might expect with an organisation as large as the Royal Navy at the turn of the 19th to the 20th centuries, their reactions were very mixed depending on the officers in question. But if you look at, the various different officers, Fisher, for example, takes up Mahan's idea of, well, you can either defend at home or you can defend abroad, but it's very difficult to do both, and do that in strength. And in some ways, that's one of the reasons why he develops the battle cruiser, because the battle cruiser's idea is to basically sweep the seas far away from home so that you can concentrate at home in strength, although that is as much predicated by the fact that the new rising threat is much closer to home in the form of the German high seas fleet. And for others, a lot of Royal Navy officers think, at least from what I can tell from their writings, that the single biggest reaction is essentially, oh, well, now look, he's gone and encouraged all these other upstarts to think they can actually, challenge us, because it's laid out, supposedly, a handbook of this is how you attain dominance of the sea and therefore how you win at the game of being a great power. Whereas before, everybody had their own competing ideas, and the fact that Britain had, kind of sat on top of that particular roost for the better part of a century meant that, well, clearly everybody else's ideas had something wrong with them, otherwise they would be there. But one of the things you've got to remember is that while Mahan is analysing an awful lot of what Britain did to get control of the sea, a lot of what he's talking about in terms of exercise of sea power subsequently, for what at that time are modern states, is he's saying, right, well, if you too want to be as successful as Britain and you want to gain control of the sea, this is what you need to do. Britain, of course, already has control of the sea, so a lot of that part is less applicable to them, and it's more a case of, okay, now people are probably going to try doing this. How do we develop counters to a Mahanian strategy? Because they're starting with that control, and their main job is not to lose it. Because, of course, when you fully read Mahan's principles, it's a very crude and very, leaves a lot out. But if you want to be very basic, you could digest what he's actually saying down into, you need to find and fix the enemy battle fleet, fight them in your big decisive battle, and that's where most people fall down. They're just like, oh, we win decisive battle, therefore we win the war, whereas Mahan's actually saying, no, you destroy the bulk of the enemy's fleet in your decisive battle, because then that gives you control of the sea, and with control of the sea, you can control trade, you can blockade, you can move troops, and all of this is what will allow you to grind the enemy down to win the war. Whereas for the British, their approach is almost the exact 180-degree opposite of the way Mahan would do things. As I said, because they already have control of the sea, their approach is, well, we're going to skip straight to the whole, we have dominance of global trade and you don't, and we're going to grind you down into a fine powder with our blockade, and basically wait for you to run out of resources, food, and everything else. And if you happen to want to come out and fight us, then we will crush you. Rebel Skvirl asks, the time period is 1880 to 1900. How would you design an ideal ship with which to conduct gunboat diplomacy without breaking the naval budget in the process? So I would probably advocate for something roughly like this, as you can see here. So this is what I would term a colonial cruiser, what might be termed a second-class cruiser in Royal Navy parlance. It's a little bit bigger than some, but it's not too large either. So allow me to explain the idea behind it. In some ways, armament-wise, it resembles a scaled-down version of the armoured cruiser principle that's in vogue at the time. So you've got a pair of 6-inch guns, one fore and one aft, and then you have 10 4-inch guns. Now, because of the hull limitations in Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts, you've got 2 casemate and 3 open mount down either side, but you could have 5 open mounts down either side, or however you wanted to do it. But the main point is you've got 10 4-inch guns and a pair of 6-inch guns, plus an underwater torpedo tube or 2. Now, another thing you might notice is there's only 2 funnels, so this is not a particularly fast cruiser. It's going to be doing, certainly at this time period, 23 knots, give or take a little bit, depending on how much power you can get into the engines. And obviously 1880 to 1900, there's quite a lot of advancement in engine technology as well. And it does have some armouring. Obviously there's gun shields for the guns, but it will also have a protected deck. So it will be a protected cruiser, but that's about it as far as protection goes. I really, as you might recall, do not hold with the unprotected third-class cruisers. They're just completely impractical. Now, what this allows you to do is it allows you to go a reasonable distance at a reasonable speed. You've got mostly light guns, so that's your kind of general gunboat diplomacy element. You've got a couple of big guns, which allow you to both hit things somewhat harder and also makes the ship at least somewhat viable against various other enemy cruisers, because you've got to remember there's a lot of cruisers floating around in the last 2 decades of the 19th century that won't have anything as large as a 6-inch gun. And, if you really want a budget option, I guess you could have just the one up front, but I'd prefer to have one at each end. And so this means that while there may be some cruisers out there that are faster than it, and there are certainly going to be cruisers out there that are better protected than it, while its primary job is tootling around doing gunboat diplomacy missions, it has just enough protection and just enough firepower that should it come to war with, an actual serious opponent, this is a fairly good, if somewhat small, commerce protection cruiser, and in numbers could also make a fleet screen for larger ships. And obviously you can fine-tune the speed and so forth. Obviously in the 1880 period, it might be a 1920 knot ship. By the 1900s, 1899, 1900, you might be looking at a 25 to 26 knot ship. It all very much depends. And then in theory, you could also use this design to make a small family of cruisers. So if you wanted a really, really high-speed scouting cruiser for the fleet, then you could put more engines in, and then maybe drop one of the waist-mounted pairs of 4-inch guns, drop the 6-inch guns, and either put single 4-inch or paired 4-inch fore and aft to save a bit of weight. And that would make a good anti-torpedo boat, anti-destroyer vessel, moving at a fair old clip. Or if you wanted something that was more of a heavy fleet cruiser that's not an armoured cruiser, then if you were using this design, for example, maybe you suppress the casement-mounted guns in exchange and move the deck-mounted guns around a bit, again, to allow you to get another funnel or so in because you put more machinery in and you can go faster with this armament and protection level. That quiet guy in the back asks, relative to the video on Typhoon Connie-Viper, I have two related questions. Firstly, while Halsey's career managed to survive taking ships into another Typhoon, there was no comment on whether or not his meteorologist also survived, career-wise. Is there any record as to whether he was cashiered or simply quietly dropped over the side? And secondly, do you think that Rear Admiral Clark would have been brought up on disciplinary charges had he simply used his own local discretion to manoeuvre independently in response to conditions while informing higher command? For the second part, I suspect if once he'd sent off his request, he then entered in the log that, hey, look, we've got this clear picture on radar and there's escalating conditions. I don't think that, the Halsey or the Commander-in-Chief has a clear idea of what we're seeing. Therefore, I'm using my authority to maneuver my own section of the fleet as I see fit, and then gone on to either evade or mostly evade the Typhoon. I don't think he would have been brought up on disciplinary charges because he would have had a fairly good excuse as to why, especially if he had it recorded that this is why I'm not going to wait for any further response. They're not in contact with the enemy, so he's not putting the fleet in immediate danger of attack by Japanese kamikazes and so forth. And ultimately, a lot of the time, in lots of different walks of life, but especially in the Navy, if you succeed, it's very difficult for them to come after you. So if part of the fleet is hit by this very vicious Typhoon, and Clark's sitting there, and afterwards Halsey's like, hang on a minute, you manoeuvred without my authorization, and Clark's sitting there going, yeah, and guess what? My fleet hasn't got all its bows smashed in. Then nothing really bad is going to happen to him at that point. Now, as far as Schematics, the meteorologist, or in the parlance of the time, aerologist on Halsey's staff, he wasn't cashiered, even though you might think after being in part responsible for both the debacles of Cobra and Viper, he continued his career in the Navy. He didn't retire until 1960. However, much as with Admiral Wright from the Battle of Tassafaronga, despite that being a complete disaster, Wright is not cashiered, but he has quietly moved off to work stateside positions and never holds an active at-sea combat command again. And I think you can infer something of that from Cosco's career, because he's a commander at the time that this all kicks off. And of course, the fact he retires in 1960 means he has another 15 years in the Navy. Now, he does go on to be the aerologist for a number of expeditions to the more freezing parts of the world, at the poles, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. But at the time that he retires, he is still a captain, and he's not promoted upon retirement to Rear Admiral or anything like that. So, well, those of you who have served in the Navy or are serving in the Navy, draw your own conclusions. A commander who has been a commander for a little bit of time at the time of an incident, which he's not specifically reprimanded for, but then manages to go through the next 15 years and only makes one advancement in rank from commander to captain, that's, I'm pretty sure, a relatively quiet judgment on whether or not they think he should be advanced any further. Fahrender Ritter asks, what was the long-term impact of U-boats from World War I, besides the German tech line and their doctrine? As in, what did the Entente and neutral powers observe and use post-World War I? So there were a bunch of different effects as the result of the German U-boat campaign in World War One. There were various attempts to restrict-ban U-boats and submarines entirely during the various naval arms control negotiations. Obviously, that didn't work out particularly well, except for killing off the cruiser submarine. There were also other effects. So obviously the British went all in on ASW, understandably, having nearly been starved out of the First World War. So it initially spurred the development of ASDIC, and then the British developed that and kept developing it and their ASW exercises during the interwar period. Various bits of German U-boat technology were studied, and in some cases they tried to replicate them. Now, it has to be said that, contrary to what you might think of if you just hear pop culture references to German U-boats, not everything aboard German U-boats in World War I was more advanced than what the Allies had. There were some areas of technology where the Allies were ahead. There were other areas of technology where the Germans were ahead, which is more of what you might expect when you're talking about two roughly peer powers competing in a brand new technological environment. So some areas, they went, yep, that's a good idea. We're going to basically steal that out of German U-boats. And other areas went, not so sure about that. I think we're going to stick with R1. And then, of course, there were some rather amusing areas of crossover, such as, for example, during the development of X1, where they went, okay, look, we don't necessarily have the best diesel technology. The Germans clearly do have more advanced diesel engine designs, so we're just going to literally lift a bunch of German U-boat diesels out of some captured U-boats and put them in as the secondary power plant on X1, only it turns out that the ones they took were from a late World War I era German U-boat, where the blockade had begun to bite. And although, technologically speaking, it was a very advanced diesel engine, it had been built with very substandard materials because the materials they wanted to build it out of weren't available, and that was one of the root causes of X1's terrible reliability. And of course, looking at various German designs, it informed the Entente and neutral powers of, okay, well, maybe this is the direction to go in with subs. Now, obviously, some submarine designs like fleet subs, to varying degrees of success, while the Germans had tried to build some, they weren't quite so obsessed with big, long-distance submarines as they were about, lots and lots of slightly shorter-range subs, because in World War I, hey, Britain's your main target, and, well, it's right there. You don't necessarily need a sub that can go all the way across the Atlantic in large numbers, at least not until the very end of the war. And then when it comes to developing things like submarine mine layers and so forth, again, you see various powers going, well, this is a German submarine mine layer, like a UC2 type or something, from the end of the First World War. So let's examine that, see what technologies they're using, and either upscale or replicate them for our own purposes. Alternate historian Turtleduck asks, what were winter quarters on board Age of Sail ships, if any? I would assume that blockading duty, for example, wouldn't stop with the onset of winter. It depends almost entirely where you are geographically, because, for example, if you are the Swedish Navy, winter quarters in the Age of Sail means you're back in port, because the Baltic's frozen over, so you're basically living ashore. Or if you are part of the caretaker crew on a ship, everything's nice and buttoned up. Whereas if, for example, you're in the Mediterranean or off the coast of India, winter quarters might very well be, oh, thank goodness we're not parboiling to death every day. It's just mildly pleasant, especially if you're from a Northern European navy. If you were from, say, the Italian Navy, then I'm pretty sure the Mediterranean winters feel fairly cold. But if you're from Newcastle and you're confronted with the Mediterranean in December, you're going to be like, it's not too bad, much better than summer. But more broadly speaking, like you have a campaign season on land, you would have a sailing season for the most part at sea, in large part, not necessarily because of the temperature, but just because winter tends to bring a lot of storms, which are quite dangerous, and obviously not a lot of light, and you're still dependent on visual for everything, pretty much when it comes to navigation and spotting things. So the majority of fleets would go back to what would be termed winter quarters, which are basically you're back in port, and some crews would then either be paid off or put into shore quarters, and there would be a small cadre of people who would have to be ready because, of course, just because it's not pleasant doesn't mean the enemy can't do stuff. So some ships do have to be crewed, but then again, it would be kind of, well, in the summer, you might be sailing around with all your gun ports open and people lolling around on deck when they're not on duty. Whereas in winter, it'd be, okay, we're closing up all the gun ports, we're covering everything we possibly can with canvas and so forth, and we're running the galley, for example, pretty much constantly to keep this small part deep inside the ship nice and warm. And yes, for prolonged periods of war, blockade duty wouldn't stop with the onset of winter, except when there were exceptionally violent winter storms, because, well, if the winter storms are getting to a point where they are far too violent for even a full-on warship with hundreds of men to stay on offshore, the chances of a merchant ship with a few dozen people on board being able to successfully make it through the storm with supplies are pretty slim. So at that point you can, take a view to your own safety and either retreat out into deeper water or potentially, if you're on the pressed blockade duty, just go back to the south coast of England for a bit. The Radar Light of the New Moon asks, do you think the damage control crew that saved Franklin on March 19th, 1945 would be able to save Akagi at the Battle of Midway? Honestly, I don't actually think so, because the damage in terms of just how many fully fueled aircraft were merrily burning away on Akagi is, while it's not massively worse than Franklin, because Franklin was pretty bad, it still wasn't brilliant, and potentially overall slightly more intense. Now, you might think, well, hang on a minute, if it's within shouting distance of Franklin, then surely they could. Well, the other problem is that while, of course, the vast majority of the credit for saving Franklin does go to the crew, who fought the damage heroically, when you look through what they had to do in order to bring those fires under control, a huge amount of their efforts are only possible thanks to the damage control systems aboard. Both the main damage control systems, such as that had survived the initial explosion, but also things like the portable pumps and so forth that they had access to. And simply put, in Midway 1942, Akagi just doesn't have anywhere near the level of damage control systems either built into her or as portable equipment as compared to Franklin. And given how close a thing Franklin was, I think no matter how heroic you are, if you're confronted with a massive petrochemical blaze amidships in a carrier, there's only so much you can do without access to pumps, firefighting foam, and firefighting protective equipment and stuff like that. And without that, the ship is eventually going to succumb. Akagi's crew fought very, very hard to save their ship. But I think that difference in the damage control equipment availability would ultimately doom the ship. Camino John asks, why was Krupp always behind in terms of large caliber naval guns in comparison to the British in the lead up to World War I? It seems to me that if you're trying to be a peer opponent, you need to manufacture peer equivalent weapons. Perhaps this can be tied to Britain's lead in the steel industry and its ability to forge large guns? Krupp wasn't necessarily behind in terms of large caliber naval guns, apart from the, that insistence on having sliding breech blocks and everything. Krupp was fully capable of building extremely large naval guns on a par scale-wise with almost anyone else in the 1900s and the 1910s. If you look at the catalogue of offerings from the various gun manufacturing companies in 1913, for example, while in 1913 the German Navy has the 12-inch gun as the biggest thing in its arsenal, because the Bardens haven't come along yet, Krupp is offering 2 or 3 guns that are considerably larger than that for sale in 1913. In a variety of caliber lengths. Now, of course, that is prospective sale, i.e. if you want this gun, we can build it for you, not necessarily we have a whole bunch of these lying around ready to go. But if you look further back in time, Krupp is not a stranger to building a 12-inch, a 14-inch, or a 16-inch gun. They haven't, in the early 1910s, built one with the modern, 45, 50 caliber lengths, but they could if they wanted to, and they are ready to do so. The bigger problem with Krupp, at least in terms of large naval gun production, is the German Navy. And the Imperial German Navy makes the decision about what kind of armament it wants. And since it is Krupp's single largest customer, if the Germans say we want an 11-inch gun, well, guess what? Krupp is building an 11-inch gun. When you look back through the various design documents for German pre-dreadnoughts and indeed early dreadnoughts, there are a number of times where a bigger gun is suggested, either by Krupp or by various naval officers, where they say, yeah, we've got an 11-inch gun, but what about using a 12? Or this design uses a 12-inch gun, what about a 13.4 or a 14 or a 16-inch? And in each case, it's the German Navy and various other political considerations who turn around and say, no, we want this smaller gun. It's never do they say, oh, we don't think Krupp can make this gun, so we're not having it. It's always a case of, well, there's all these other reasons for not having it. So Krupp can do it, but they are limited by, well, if their biggest customer only orders smaller guns, I guess they're only making smaller guns, regardless of what the gun foundries, technically speaking, could make. Now, in Britain, there admittedly are a few other factors playing into things. Firstly, of course, while the Royal Navy is the biggest customer, and they do have a penchant for wanting bigger guns than the Imperial German Navy does in a given year, you've also got to remember that in the run-up to World War I, Britain is the leading exporter of warships, and so even if the Royal Navy isn't necessarily going for the latest and greatest weapon that a particular gun manufacturer can make, there's a very good chance that a whole bunch of other foreign navies might want to go with that weapon. Poor old Vickers salesman trying to sell his 14-inch guns aside. So not only do they have a much larger outlet for potential alternate designs, but also the companies in the UK are perhaps a little bit more open to risk than Krupp. Krupp tends to play things relatively conservatively. So they'll say, yes, we can build you this gun, but we're not going to actually do any work on that unless and until we've got firm order on the books, for the most part. Whereas you've got to remember a lot of the British companies, some companies are pure gunsmiths, but a lot of companies, they make guns and they make ships. And they make armour, and they make engines, and they make all sorts of things. And 10, 15, 20 years before World War I, some of those companies were building entire warships on speculation, i.e. there was no customer, there was no order, there was no specific interest, but they're like, we're going to build this cruiser, and we're pretty sure that by the time we've built it, someone's going to want one, and, well, then we've got one ready for sale for cash in hand. And while the era of building a large-scale warship on speculation was fairly much over by the 1900s and 1910s, just because of the massively increased costs involved, there were occasions where British companies would go, you know what, yes, at the moment we're in, let's say, the 13.5-inch gun era, but I'm pretty sure somebody somewhere along the line in the next year or two is going to want a 16-inch gun, so let's start work on one, because it's a pretty good bet that someone's going to be buying one. And then we can get a leg up in the market. So, yeah, building guns on speculation. Elite Corsair asks, I've heard you mention all-carronade frigates in some of your past work, and some of my favourite games like Empire Total War mention things like the interesting anecdote about HMS Glatton. Could you provide any more information about the history of all-carronade frigates? Were they generally successful, or were they a waste of resources? And did any ever drop a nice big surprise on a bigger ship that didn't see it coming? There were a limited number of all-carronade frigates and other smaller ships around during the Napoleonic Wars. Of course, once the British had started deploying the carronades in numbers, one of the big questions was, well, hey, since we tend to fight most of our actions at pretty close range, and carronades are pretty close-range weapons but offer a lot more firepower than their equivalent long gun for the same weight, what about just replacing all the ship's guns with carronades? That'll give us a lot more firepower. And that actually leads to one of the more amusing incidents of the Napoleonic Wars, where you have the frigate HMS Rainbow, formerly a small ship of the line. Now, she is experimentally refitted with an entirely carronade armament, including some really monstrous ones. And in true British style of the time, having just commissioned their newly experimental vessel, they're just like, well, let's go out and find the nearest Frenchman to test it on. And they find the Hebe, a brand new French frigate. Now, in theory, because the Hebe's main gun, or Hebe possibly, because her main gun deck is long 18-pounder guns, she could, in theory, pull off what would eventually be pulled off against the USS Essex in the War of 1812 and just sit at range and bombard the all-carronade ship from a distance where it can't reply. But of course, they don't know that the pursuing Rainbow is an all-carronade ship. They don't even really know much about carronades at all at that point. And so Rainbow starts chasing, and Hebe decides to make a bit of a dash for it. And they're thinking, okay, well, we can evaluate what's going on. They're going to fire their bow chasers. We can fire our stern chasers. And we'll make a judgment call as to how we're going to fight from then. Now, of course, Rainbow's chase guns are 32-pounder carronades, and so a 32-pounder ball comes sailing in, smashes up a bit of the Hebe, and the French captain looks at it and goes, okay, this thing's chase guns are 32-pounders? Yeah, this ain't a frigate. This is a big ship of the line in disguise. Probably a third rate, maybe bigger. I'm not dumb enough to try and fight a ship of the line with my frigate, so I'm going to give you one broadside for honor and then surrender before I get cut to pieces. And then, of course, Rainbow rocks up and they're just like, that's really weird, but a bit late, especially because, of course, even if they did think about the dishonourable thing of switching their surrender out, at that point, Rainbow is right next to them in broadside. That is the one place you do not want to be when facing a ship fully loaded out with heavy carronades. But the British do quickly realise that a ship that's entirely equipped with carronades does have these big range limitations, so even Rainbow does get refitted again armament-wise, and while there are some ships that have a very large number of carronades on board, their bow and stern chasers, and very often their lower gun decks at least, are still long guns, so they're kind of hybrid ships. Now, that doesn't necessarily hold true in every single case, so for example, against Cyan and Levant, two very small warships, the last two that Constitution would fight in the War of 1812. In those cases, they're very small ships. They're being used on convoy escort duty, but of course, being small, they're relatively swift and relatively agile. And in those cases, the British kind of look at them and go, right, well, if they come across similar size ships to themselves, then in theory, with their relatively light standard armament, they'll be okay. But if they come across anything that's actually fully rated, even a standard 6th rate or a 5th rate, let alone a super frigate, then they're pretty much stuffed and they'll just be demolished immediately. So, given that they are small, fast and agile, we might as well equip them with lots of carronades and make them all carronade ships because, well, against peer opponents, i.e. ships of a similar size, that engagement is going to probably take place at very, very close range because of the massively unpredictable and inaccurate nature of firing from very small ships in the middle of the ocean, at which point the range advantage that those other ships might have is basically non-existent because they're going to have to fight up close to hit anything. And then if they do come across something that's much bigger and outguns them, they might stand a fighting chance. Yes, they could still be shot to pieces at long range, but if they manage to get in close, they can actually, at least if they're operating in 2s and 3s, deliver a broadside that's as great or greater than the bigger ship that's going after them. And that's exactly what Cyan and Levant tried to do to Constitution, and Constitution in some ways gets very lucky, and in other ways gets fortunate from the fact that she's got a fairly experienced commander, and manages just about to use her superior long-range firepower to put down Cyan and Levant independently. But even Constitution's captain, A, commends their tactics, and B, afterwards, essentially, when he's writing up his report, he essentially says, yeah, look, if these two had actually gotten into close broadside range with me together, this could have been a very, very different battle. But there's a very good reason why I fought the way I did, and that's why we won. So, you know, this is, it kind of shows both the advantage and the disadvantage, because Cyan and Levant, if they'd just been armed with, 6-pounders, the whole thing would have been over before it started. The fact they were armed fully with carronades meant that they had the confidence to try and take on Constitution, but then the limitations of both their size and durability and the range of their guns meant that Constitution, in that case, won anyway. But if it had been a less well-handled ship, they might well have pulled off an unexpected victory. Yokosuka Girls Marines High School training vessel Harakaze asks, much is known about Operation Downfall and the Japanese build-up of defences in the event that this happened, with most attention being on the Imperial Japanese Army. But what was the Imperial Japanese Navy's involvement in the defence plans codenamed Operation Yeah, so Ketsu-gō was kind of the broad umbrella term for the defense of the Japanese home islands. There were lots of individual operations and plans within Ketsu-gō that obviously would be their own separate thing. But for the Japanese Navy's involvement, this consisted, at least on paper, of three main phases. And one of the things you've got to remember is that the Japanese had actually fairly correctly anticipated where the Allies would land if they'd gone ahead with Olympic. I mean, to be fair, there's not a huge amount of places you can actually conceivably land very large armies in Japan. So it wasn't exactly like there was a massive list of options to pick from. But hey, the Japanese knew their own territory pretty well, and they picked right. So they would have been waiting. Now, the Japanese plan, navally at least, consisted of two main phases and then a possible third phase, depending on how things went. Phase 1 consisted of what you might call the near-littoral environment, so just as the US or Allied invasion fleet is coming in towards Japan. And this would consist of basically the last ride of the Japanese fleet submarines. Some of them as full submarines firing torpedoes, others launching Kai-10, the little suicide torpedoes. And at this stage, under Ketsu-gō, the Japanese were no longer interested in trying to take out big American warships. So they weren't going to be targeting the carriers, they weren't going to be targeting the battleships. They were going to be almost entirely targeting troop transports, landing craft, and other things like that, both to cause maximum casualties and to obviously minimize the number of American troops that made it ashore. The Japanese plan wasn't so much to defeat the US military in a straight-up confrontation, it was just to cause so much human suffering to the American troops that in theory the American public would demand some other kind of end to the war, or make it essentially either politically or realistically impossible for the Americans to continue the invasion. So once that was done, and they weren't expecting much to come back from that, as you entered the near shore environment and the landings commenced, they had a number of other methods to hand. Obviously, you would have the regular kamikaze aircraft coming in at all times, but they had Navy divers in basically little underwater bunkers, and they would be releasing mines and using other forms of direct attack munitions on landing craft as they passed overhead. They also had a variety of small submarines, like the carriage and a slightly earlier version. And these were essentially midget subs, which could optionally take torpedoes and be used as torpedo vessels, but they also had the option to just stick a massive great warhead in them and use them as a somewhat more capable giant Kai-10. So they would have sent those out. They also had suicide motorboats, which, much like some of the Italian Mars boats that just had a massive bomb up front and were designed to be driven into the side of an enemy ship, except with the Japanese version, you didn't get out. You just piloted it all the way in. So all of this would have been attacking the amphibious landing forces. It was also planned that any and all surviving destroyers, or anything vaguely destroyer-like, would sortie out and try and use torpedoes and gunfire on the surface in support of these smaller suicide craft to try and, again, inflict as much casualties as possible on the landing forces. And that was where Phase 2 came to end. That's kind of the closer in bit. The overall plan for Ketsu-gō obviously called for not a huge amount of resistance to take place on the actual landing beaches themselves, more to draw the US troops in away from direct naval gunfire support and so forth, and try and then isolate and cut them down inland. But also the naval element of the plan, while it was partially about attrition against the landing ships, so you couldn't land as many troops on Japanese soil itself, it was anticipated that these attacks would continue once the US has succeeded in the landing, because they weren't under any illusions that they would successfully repulse all the landings. It was a case of, well, we can mitigate those landings, and then once they start trying to feed more and more troops onto Japanese home soil, they're then stuck in place. They have to defend a fixed location, and we can then obviously hit them more and more and more. The third somewhat optional phase of things was what to do with the few remaining heavy surface assets of the Japanese Navy. Now, of course, in the closing stages of the Pacific War, the US Navy was making fairly good inroads on sinking anything significant that was still afloat in port. But, for example, they didn't get Nagato. And the idea there, which is why I say it's optional, is that, yeah, these things still, even for a very short-range mission, require a huge amount of fuel compared to the smaller suicide craft. But if possible, once the American landing forces are fixed in place, and especially if the suicide attacks have weakened their defenses somewhat, then you might conduct a very short-range version of Tengo using something like Nagato. So, sail 50, 60 miles down the coast at full speed under the cover of night, and then just plow straight through the amphibious forces and fight until you get blown up. But they appreciated that there may not actually be enough fuel to carry out even that, and so the primary goal of ships like Nagato that were still around was more to defend specific areas. Like Nagato was supposed to defend Tokyo Bay, as a kind of a static gunfire support platform that you'd have to come past or sink in order to access that area of Japan. So that bit was left a little bit, floating depending on exactly how successful the main phases went and how much fuel they had left. Lawson Tse asks, had the Washington Naval Treaty not placed limitations on warship construction and sale, would there have been enough demand for naval export to stave off the atrophy of the British naval shipbuilding industry during the interwar years? How could the treaty be structured to enable naval export while addressing concerns that signatories would evade the treaty by storing frontline warships with close allies? So, in terms of the treaty being structured to enable naval export while addressing issues of, why the British might just, sell an entire battle squadron to Australia and another one to Canada as a loose fig leaf for, improving their standing navally, I think there's not really a way of specifically addressing that because, if you build a 35,000-ton capital ship, and how do you define how close an ally someone is? Because Chile is a pretty good friend to Britain, but in all honesty, if Britain sold Chile a ship and they actually received it, like Almirante Latorre as opposed to Almirante Cochrane, with the best will in the world, I don't really see the Chileans giving up their ship just because the British asked them to once they've got it. But of course, you could perhaps more easily understand concerns about the Royal Canadian Navy or the Royal Australian Navy just turning around and going, hey, yeah, we'll join in with another war. But then where exactly do you put that dividing line? Because you're going to either draw the line far too close, in which case there will be other people out there, and this is not just Britain, we're just using Britain as an example, but there will be people out there who will quite happily pile in and help you or quote-unquote return their ships. And if you draw the line too far out, you end up insulting a huge number of potential people, potential countries who would have no real intention of helping you out or helping out another country. Because remember, this is a condition that's being imposed by all sorts of interests at Washington. So for the US, let's say if the US is driving this, for example, they don't necessarily want to massively negatively impact their relationship with other powers by saying, oh no, we think you're untrustworthy and you might just give ships to the British. They might or they might not, but basically straight up telling them that by putting them on one side or the other of a dividing line isn't really good politics. So I think there are two ways of going about it. Possibly, if the treaty restrictions are just held to be, not just built for your own navy, but any ships you build for anybody's navy has to follow these treaty restrictions, then there would have to be some kind of maybe written enjoinder that says these ships may never be used to assist this person, the seller's original navy. But I think that wouldn't really work because, one, in war, no one's really going to pay the slightest bit of attention to a scrap of paper they wrote on behalf of a third party. And two, that actually has fairly significant implications on the various global alliances, because who is this naval treaty to say that such and such a country may not at some point in the future want to conduct an alliance with a country that was selling it weapons. I think the only other way of potentially addressing it, and again, neither of these ways are really particularly brilliant, but the other way that possibly might have a bit more traction would be to have a separate or footnoted categorization for export vessels. So let's say that your cruisers, for example, your Washington Treaty cruisers, 10,000 tons, 8-inch guns. You maybe put a clause in that says that any cruisers you sell for export can be a maximum of 8,000 tons. Or for battleships, at Washington it's 35,000 tons and 16-inch guns. So maybe you put in a restriction that says 14 or 15-inch guns and maximum of 30,000 tons for capital ships built for export. And that would be a way of potentially of mitigating the issues, in as much as if your 10,000 ton 8-inch cruiser and your 35,000 ton 16-inch battleship are your new arbiters of power, if you make your export ships manifestly weaker, because obviously a 35,000 ton ship with 16-inch guns compared to a 30,000 ton ship with 14 or 15-inch guns, that latter ship is most of the time going to be somewhat less capable and therefore somewhat less desirable on the front line of a fleet. And therefore, you could see that as a way of trying to rule out those ships being used to support the original builder nation, or even if they are, they won't be particularly useful, relatively speaking. Now, of course, at the end of the day, an 8,000-ton cruiser is still an 8,000-ton cruiser. There are plenty of cruisers in everybody's fleets that are below that and are still considered useful, and even with capital ships, a 30,000-ton ship armed with 14 or 15-inch guns is probably still going to be, especially if it's a modern design, far more capable than something like, say, the Arkansas. So it's by far an imperfect solution, and I don't think they go for it, but I think those are probably the only two ways you could really maintain some kind of export market. At least the principles behind those would be the only way in a Washington Treaty environment. But because of the massive glaring imperfections in it, I think that's probably why they just didn't go for it at all. If there weren't any restrictions placed on warship export due to the Washington Naval Treaty, could that have staved off the atrophy of British naval shipbuilding? Not entirely, but certainly it would have helped. Because, of course, assuming some kind of treaty is coming in, the Royal Navy, the main customer of the British shipbuilding industry, is going to be much reduced in its orders. However, if export limitations either aren't in place or are basically just, well, you can't export anything that you couldn't build for yourself, the market for export warships has dramatically reduced in the aftermath of World War I, but there may still be a limited market there. And a market for refits and everything as well. So getting a few capital ship orders in the latter part of the 20s might be enough to keep some of the British shipyards and gun foundries open just long enough, or give them just enough of a cash injection that they might survive the Great Depression and thus still be in some kind of condition to be useful when rearmament picks up again. It very much depends on who's buying what from whom. Larry G asks, I'm curious about the structures on top of the 1930s US battleships' tripods masts. These things were 3 stories tall, so what was in them? Was weight an issue? Did they have any armour? Cruisers seem to have a version of them as well. Did they have more of an issue dealing with them? Yeah, the structures atop the cage masts of US battleships did tend to grow and grow and grow as time went on. This, for example, is the Arizona in the 1930s. Now, admittedly, by this point, Arizona, as you can probably just about tell, has been refitted with tripod masts, but this kind of 3-story structure, I just chose this picture because it's a really good forward-looking picture, or look down the bow, is also present on multiple ships in the 30s that still have their lattice masts in place, like the Colorados, as seen here. Now, in terms of what's on board them, obviously there are the 3 levels, so At the very top level, you have the main gun battery director, or a main gun battery director. Obviously, you've got a foremast and a mainmast. Then on the second level is the main battery spotting position. So you'd have the top position, which is often cylindrical. You can probably see in both photos. So that's where your director, rangefinder, etc. is. Then the next level down, you have people going, okay, well, that's giving the information either down to the plotting room or to the guns, depending on how it's all set up at various different times. Now we're going to spot where the fall of shot is, because obviously they can spot a much broader part of the horizon than the obviously very narrow field of view of the rangefinders. And then on most US ships of the period, the third level, the widest level, actually has 2 rangefinder-director positions, and that one on either side, and those are positions to provide range and direction to the secondary battery, the 5-inch guns. And in terms of armour, well, no, there really isn't any. It's probably shrapnel and a little bit blast-proof just because of the necessity of the strength needed to support all the stuff that's up there. But you're not putting any substantial armour up there without A, overloading the mast, and B, causing stability issues. And it would be a basically similar principle for the armoured cruisers and so forth that had a similar setup. And was weight an issue? Well, yes, weight was definitely an issue. That's why when you look at the lattice masts of, say, the Arizona, when she still had them, and the New Mexicos and so forth, when you get to the Colorados, which obviously have much more equipment up there, you get a somewhat different design of the lattice mast with much heavier reinforcement. And it also signals the end of the lattice mast, because then when you look at, like we said, Arizona in refit, which we saw at the beginning of this question, when she's been refitted in the interwar period, in order for her to support a similar level or better equipment than what's found on the Colorados in the 20s, it's found that her lattice mast, being more lightly built, just isn't up to the task of supporting that weight, so they replace it with a tripod. And the reason you see these kind of massive monolithic structures go away on the more modern US fast battleships is essentially because a lot of the functions are removed. So you get secondary battery directors and rangefinders mounted on their own separate sections lower down on the ship, but on the port and starboard side. Go to any preserved US museum fast battleship to see those. And similarly, the actual fire control rangefinders and obviously not the plotting computers, but a good chunk of the equipment is in part still found on the top of, say, the foremast of an Iowa, but there are also secondary positions elsewhere. But it's essentially just the top segment of this 3-story fighting platform that's left at the top of the forward superstructure and the aft superstructure in the US fast battleships, because general observation now can be done by both people within, say, the Mark 38 position, but also by other people scattered all around the ship in various positions. So having to mount things right at the very, very top of a specific mast, it becomes less of an issue when you get the massive monolithic superstructures that the US fast battleships and, other navies as well in various forms adopt. Duke Master asks, if you were the chief gunnery officer of a battleship, what are the required or preferred attributes for the position? What are your duties in combat, and what are your duties out of combat? Now, things do vary from navy to navy slightly, but not by a huge amount. So your general duties, especially when out of combat, include things like training other gunners to improve their skills. You're also generally in charge of the ship's small arms and training people to be certified and qualified with those small arms, because basically the chief gunnery officer has charge of everything to do with and related to any kind of firearm, whether that be a 16-inch battleship gun or a pistol or a rifle or anything in between. So, for example, in the US Navy, in the time period that the Channel covers, particularly in the early 20th century, according to the US Navy Manual of Seamanship, it says the head of the gunnery department is the officer detailed by the chief or of the Bureau of Naval Personnel as the ship's gunnery officer. He has supervision over and is responsible for the entire ordnance equipment of the ship. The gunnery officer is charged with the efficiency of all armament and apparatuses there are too. The cleanliness and good condition of all ammunition stowage spaces and workshops, stowage and care of explosives, necessary inspections, examinations and tests, and issuing of safety orders for operating equipment and handling munitions. And it goes on like this. He's senior to all watch and division officers and has as assistants the assistant fire control officer, officers in various gun divisions, the officers of the fire control division, and the chief of gunnery, and the officers assigned to the aviation and torpedo duties. The gunnery officer's battle station is normally primary main battle control. So, broadly speaking, the chief gunnery officer, he has to maintain the magazines, he has to maintain the ammunition hoist, not personally obviously, but has to supervise and ensure they all are, as well as turrets, mounts, the guns themselves, training and operation of all of these, where necessary, weird as it might sound, also as it suggests things like torpedoes, because essentially he's the ordnance officer, and as well as training everybody else. Then when it comes to wartime, as it suggests, he's probably going to be in what in the US Navy is called the plotting room, or the main fire control room, whatever you want to call it, basically where the fire control computer is. That is going to be his normal battle station. And as a result, you need to actually have good leadership qualities and a good working knowledge, not just of gunnery, but also of all the various mechanical gubbins that go into gunnery at that time. So you not only need to know how to shoot straight with all sorts of ordnance, because you've got to instruct everybody else in how to do that, but it also means that, if something breaks down, or if something's not being maintained properly, or something's breaking all the time, you need to have the expertise to look at it and go, that needs to be fixed, and this is how you need to fix it, in the event that your subordinates haven't managed to do that already. TST 1987 asks, destroyers, corvettes, sloops, and all other manners of ships have been ramming, or rather running over, submarines ever since submarines first surfaced in World War I. Why don't we see specialised running over submarine ram bows on anti-submarine assets like destroyers, destroyer escorts and corvettes, or at the very least reinforced bows and bulkheads up front on smaller ships, so that they can ram or run over subs without damaging themselves seriously or even sinking themselves? In part because, well, a ram bow is a fairly hefty bit of structure, and that can be much more easily absorbed on a big cruiser or a battleship, but on something that is only displacing a few hundred tons, maybe just over 1,000, adding, double-digit ton weight of heavy ram bow could have a fairly deleterious effect on the overall ship design, as well as its trim and all sorts of things like that. Plus, of course, ideally speaking, you don't necessarily want your ships to be ramming the enemy. They can do, obviously, but any ram also does damage to your own ship, and therefore it's better to destroy them with depth charges and so forth. And this comes up with another problem, which is that very often, especially if you talk about corvettes and sloops, the submarine they are ramming may well be of a similar displacement, if not a greater displacement, than they themselves. And submarine pressure hulls tend to be relatively heavily built, at which point, just because you have a ram on the bow doesn't necessarily mean that your ship's going to come out of it in any particularly good shape, because, well, for one thing, if you have a really strong ram bow, what it's going to do is it's going to transmit the shock of the ram to the rest of your ship's structure. And if the rest of your ship is relatively lightly built, like, say, a Flout-class corvette, then you're going to be twisting frames and starting plates elsewhere in the ship, which isn't a good thing. Another problem, of course, is that, as a number of ships that did ram submarines found, if your sonar dome is underneath your ship and you ram into a submarine and then run over it, you tend to rip your sonar off, which isn't brilliant. And a lot of these ships also tend to be either single screw, or if they have twin screws, those screws project either below or very close to below the keel line. And so you can also damage your propellers and rudder by running over an enemy sub. So it's not a free action that purely does damage to the submarine, except in very specific circumstances. And so having something that impinges on the other qualities of the ship and essentially exists deliberately to encourage a ship to do something which is probably going to knock it out of action as well, isn't really the most brilliantly thought out tactic. Now, strengthening the overall bow structure to a degree to allow it to take heavier impacts, that definitely could help when taking on a submarine, but you still are going to have the same kind of issues, because, of course, anything that theoretically allows your ship to ram an enemy harder and take less damage is going to encourage people to go faster, which means even more energy, which means potentially even more damage, and so on and so forth. I think if you absolutely wanted to have something fitted to the bows to help with physical contact with subs, then probably the best solution from a bunch of not particularly brilliant ones wouldn't be so much a ram bow, but just generally strengthening the bow area to take more damage. You could probably cover that under ice strengthening as well, given some of the areas these ships have to operate. And instead of having a ram bow in the traditional sense, maybe have some kind of downward facing, maybe even reverse facing fin, blade, spike, don't know exactly what you'd call it. Now, obviously, that is going to have something of a slight drag effect on the ship as it goes around normally, and might increase the draft of the ship slightly. But you'd also have to couple it with something that could very rapidly retract your ASDIC or sonar dome. But the idea of this thing, when connected to the overall strengthened bow structure, wouldn't be to encourage you to ram something head on, but would encourage perhaps the slightly slower kind of ram and run over that you see happening at times. Because then as the ship lifts up and onto the enemy sub, then of course the submarine's casing is fairly fragile, so your bow will crunch through that, and then this acts as kind of a downward pointing almost tooth that could then use your ship's bulk and weight to punch through the pressure hull, as well as actually also being a fairly significant friction event, so preventing you from maybe completely overrunning the sub. So you hit it, you kind of punch into it, but then you've got a degree of resistance in you moving further along. Now, ideally, obviously, you probably also want some kind of breakaway bolt so that you don't end up permanently stuck to the sub, but then that could encourage the thing to break off generally, which wouldn't necessarily be that good. But the idea would essentially be that if you are going to end up ramming a sub, you would end up doing so in such a way the sub ends up stuck to your bows, so you don't go and wreck your undersides and all the way back. It also means that you'd be encouraged to move somewhat more slowly in your ram. Even if your approach is relatively quick, you'd kind of coast in the last little bit. And it would also obviously, potentially puncture the enemy pressure hull a bit more reliably. And then either when the enemy sinks, it'll pull itself off and go down, or if you've kind of cut into it a bit like a blade, you can back out and let the sub sink. Now, it's not a good solution. I'm not saying this definitely should be installed, but if someone put a gun to my head and said you have to design some kind of feature into escorts that will allow them to more easily and successfully ram enemy subs, that is probably what I would suggest, along with the strengthened bow structure generally. Alex Moskowitz asks, I was reading about Joshua Slocum, and it was said he had to put down 3 mutinies while leading commercial sailing voyages in the 1890s. How common were mutinies on commercial ships in that period? Would they be more frequent on sailing versus steamships, or was he just a really bad captain? 3 mutinies under the same captain is somewhat unusual, but mutinies on commercial ships generally, at least in terms of freighters and other low crewed ships as opposed to big ocean liners with hundreds of crew, were much more common than you might imagine. They weren't the kind of, oh yes, in another day, another mutiny kind of thing. But they did happen on a much more regular basis than you would find in warships, partly because the regulations for exactly what constituted acceptable behavior for a ship's captain were a lot looser in the merchant marine. There might be rules for an individual merchant line, but a privately owned ship or a line that doesn't really regulate its captains all that much, there was a much wider potential range of abuse of authority by the captain. And of course, with the crew being somewhat smaller, then those effects would be felt a lot more harshly, especially if the captain started to play favourites and so forth. Plus, the crew would be a lot more disparate and a lot more mercenary because, again, on a big ocean liner, you might have a certain degree of loyalty towards the home company. But for general freight traffic, whether that be sail or steam, you're hired potentially just for that voyage, potentially even for only part of that voyage. You may not share a nationality or a language with a good chunk of the other sailors. You may have picked some random sailors up in some random port because some of your others decided to desert or whatever. And there's just so many more variables for the voyage becoming either miserable or having divisions sewn in it. All sorts of things going wrong potentially that could lead to resentment building. And if the captain doesn't have a way of dealing with that very easily, or at least quickly, then you would very quickly end up with all sorts of problems going down. And one of those could be a mutiny. Now, of course, there are also levels of mutiny because, technically speaking, mutiny can just include, look, we're not following your orders until you shape up, or we're not following your orders until you pay us, or we demand at the next port that you get some better food than this stuff which kind of moves of its own accord until you hit it repeatedly with a marlin spike, and all sorts of things like this. Kind of relatively limited, do this or else kind of stuff. And then, of course, you get all the way up to, hey, we're in command of the ship now, get on this boat and pray for that you're a good navigator. And that kind of stuff, the more classic mutiny. So, yes, mutinies are more common in 18th and 19th century merchant ships than they are on warships. They're still not massively common because obviously it's in everybody's interest, both in terms of safety and in getting paid, for captains to at least have a modicum of leadership capability and actually doing their job. Chief Eyeroll asks, for October the 13th and 14th bombardment of Henderson Field, how effective were the Japanese Navy's Type 3 14-inch shells compared to high explosive in damaging the airfield, aircraft and support facilities? Did the Type 3s need special fusing or correction for their fusing during that bombardment? They were quite effective, but you've got to remember that the Henderson Field bombardment missions used a mixture of shell types. Because you can kind of see all the cratering around Henderson Field in this photo. Now, the part of the reason for the mixture of shell types is that no one shell was brilliant at everything that was needed. So a Type 3, the main reason they were using that, it scatters a huge amount of shrapnel and incendiaries all over the place. This is really good at cutting up light and setting fire to light buildings, fuel bowsers, fuel storage dumps, and aircraft. Well, shockingly enough, given that that's what it's designed to destroy in the first place. And of course, if you've got any kind of little trenches, revetments, embankments, etc., then Type 3 shell detonating in midair will obviate a lot of those defences. So really good at all that kind of stuff. But scattering a few bits of shrapnel and some bits of burning metal over the runway isn't really going to stop the runway operating. So that's why you need things like HE shells and potentially even a few AP shells to crater the runway. And similarly with more hardened things like ammunition storage areas. Unless someone's been really, really lax, a Type 3 detonating in midair isn't really going to do all that much to a ammunition storage bunker, but an HE or an AP shell will. So you mix things in. But for what they were useful for, destroying and damaging aircraft and other light equipment, they were pretty darn effective. In terms of did they need special fusing? Not particularly, because remember, the Sanshiki shell already comes with an inbuilt mechanical timer because it needs to know when to detonate while it's traveling through the air, in theory, somewhere in the vicinity of an aircraft. And so if you know the range from your ship to Henderson Field, then you also know the flight time of the shell, and then you can set the timer on your Sanshiki shells to detonate a little bit before that time elapses. And then in theory, if you time it right, using exactly the same mechanism and setting as you would if you're using an anti-aircraft roll, then you could just drop exploding, burning metal and fragments from airburst detonations all over the place, which is what they tried to do. Baron von Faust asks, following with my obsession for interwar destroyer shenanigans, I found a note in D.K. Brown's work that suggests that during the search for a dual-purpose destroyer gun, the 5-inch 42 originally made for submarine mounts was considered. Do you have any details about such an idea? I think you mean the 5.2-inch 42, which is the gun that was used on the X-1, the big cruiser sub as seen here. That would certainly be the only 42 caliber length, 5-point-something-ish submarine gun in the interwar period for the Royal Navy that I can think of. Now, nonetheless, also, at some point, could you drop me a message telling me which one of D.K. Brown's many works you found that particular note in? Because I went through most of the usual suspects, and I couldn't see anything during quite a bit of searching. But that's not to say, that D.K. Brown wrote so many books and so many articles, I probably missed it somewhere. But I'd be personally interested in knowing where that note is. In any case, so I don't specifically have details about that particular idea at this point in time, although if I had access to that note, I could probably hunt them down for you. But in more broad terms, actually, the Royal Navy was looking into dual-purpose anti-aircraft guns pretty much during the entirety of the interwar period. Now, this admittedly does fly in the face of the more common narrative of the Royal Navy just being satisfied with mostly surface action guns with a certain degree of anti-aircraft capability. But to be honest, even that falls apart on closer inspection, because yes, the destroyers accepted limited elevation because they didn't think the destroyers were going to be targeted so much, and that saved weight, which allowed them to put that weight towards other things than destroyers. But there were fairly high angle 4.7-inch guns mounted on battleships, for instance, so that was certainly a thing. But also, when you look through the development history of heavy anti-aircraft guns and dual-purpose guns in the Royal Navy, the Royal Navy is circling constantly in about a 1-inch caliber range. So even as far back as the immediate post-World War I period, running up into and actually before the Washington Naval Treaty, so we're talking about the G3, N3 development line. At that point, they're actually looking into seeing if the 5.5-inch gun, the one that they found that the Greeks had ordered originally and they quite liked and was actually used as the secondary battery in Hood, they were actually looking to see if the 5.5-inch could be made into a dual-purpose gun to basically replace both the 6-inch and the 4.7-inch, and at that point the 3-inch as well. And there was some consideration to installing a secondary battery entirely of dual-purpose 5.5 inches in various ships, of which obviously the G3 and the N3 would be the final permutations thereof. But they couldn't quite make it work, somewhat understandably perhaps, because the 5.5-inch was admittedly a very good gun, but probably just a fraction too big for dual-purpose work, especially in the late 1910s, early 1920s. And so they went, okay, fine, well, we can't do that, so we'll go with the 6-inch, which is some slightly better, in theory, anti-surface weapon, and the 4.7-inch for anti-aircraft use, which is why you get the 6-inch, 4.7-inch split battery on the Nelsons. But then as time goes on through the interwar period, they look at the 4.5, the 4.7, the 5-inch, the 5.1-inch, obviously the 5.2-inch, eventually the 5.25-inch, and in all of that, obviously a relatively lightweight, reasonably capable gun like the 5.2-inch 42, which is the X1 gun, that is naturally going to come up as consideration. I mean, apart from anything else, when they were looking at potential successors for X1, there was some deliberation as to whether to make the 5.2-inch 42 dual purpose just for the submarine. And, well, if that worked, it would make sense to make that at least a dual-purpose gun, at least on capital ships, if not necessarily even on smaller vessels. So the long and the short of it is, yes, the Royal Navy was very, very interested in the idea of a dual-purpose anti-surface-anti-air weapon throughout the interwar period. They just never quite seemed to manage to crack something that met all of their requirements. Although, as I've said before, personally, with a relatively minor deviation from history, I think they probably should have solidified around the 4.5 a lot earlier. But there you go. So yeah, especially if you could drop me a note as to which of D.K. Brown's books you find that note in, because I'd really actually be interested to see how far down the rabbit hole they went with the 5.242 in their search for an anti-aircraft weapon before they dropped it. Whether it was just a kind of a passing fancy, or did they seriously consider it? Not Shaped for Sportive Tricks asks, Hydrack, did anyone ever try to use Congreve rockets or their equivalent in a naval battle during the Age of Sail? I'm aware of the potential inaccuracy of these weapons, as demonstrated by Harry Flashman at the Battle of the Aral Sea. Nevertheless, I think their use would be quite intimidating. the prospect of a couple of dozen of these things flying at your highly combustible wooden ship is enough to put the wind up most captains, I would suspect. As far as I know, there was no formal adoption of the Congreve rocket as a direct fire weapon in ship-to-ship combat, for a number of reasons. Firstly, the inaccuracy that you point out. A smoothbore cannon of the period is not the world's most accurate weapon. A Congreve rocket is a whole other level beyond that. Plus, of course, you have the problem of having explosive incendiaries aboard the ship, and if they're out on the gun decks where enemy shot and shell is flying, particularly obviously shot in the Napoleonic period, the possibility of something going horribly wrong aboard your own ship is much increased. And of course, Congreve rockets produce an awful lot of flame and smoke as they are fired, so your other problem would be, how do you deal with that flame and smoke not choking out or setting fire to your own vessel? Now, they did develop a ship that could actually fire broadsides of rockets as opposed to setting up rocket launchers on deck, which was done on a few more bombardment vessels and certainly on a lot of small boats that were used as attack craft. And this is HMS Galgo, as you can see here. And she had a specially set up system whereby, as you can see, the rockets were mounted relatively deep in the ship, fired out of these little scuttle ports below her carronade arm, which was up on the main deck. And they actually had specially loaded iron gun ports which dropped down at the minute the rocket exited. So you would get a little bit of smoke and flame as the rocket launched, but ideally as soon as the rocket's body exited the ship, then these little iron gun ports would hop down and the remaining smoke and flame would be confined to outside the ship. And as you can see, she was a rather spectacular vessel when she let go with multiple rocket launcher ports, because she had something approaching, I think, a couple of dozen of the things. However, they were only used in bombardment missions against shore targets and against enemy ships that were moored, so not in a straight-up mobile sea battle. So, yeah, they would be fairly intimidating, but the dangers and the inaccuracies involved made them not a practical replacement for cannons in straight-up combat. But, yeah, if you have a little bit more control of the situation and can just lob random burning rockets at people when they happen to be stationary, because at that point it doesn't matter if you miss that stationary ship, there might be another one very nearby, or some land that you can set fire to, then, yeah, they were used and they were very, very intimidating. Library of Context asks, what was the largest bore muzzle-loaded weapon ever mounted to and fired from a naval vessel? My assumption would be some sort of bombardment mortar from the US Civil War or the Crimean War, but that's just a guess. That would have been my first instinct as well, but when I looked into it, actually, in terms of naval mortars, there are plenty of big mortars that were designed but never fired aboard a ship. Some were even produced. But the biggest mortars that I could find being regularly used in the Age of Sail or in the Crimean War, in the Civil War, were 13-inch mortars. And that meant they weren't actually the biggest. The biggest gun that was muzzle loading that I can definitively prove was mounted aboard and fired aboard a ship is this thing, the 100-ton gun, or the rifled muzzle loading 17.7-inch gun, which survives today in Gibraltar and Malta as shore installations, but was also mounted aboard an Italian ironclad or two, and test fired and fired in exercises aboard there. So I think, unless anyone can prove otherwise, that this 17.7-inch, fired into being a rifled muzzleloader, would be the largest bore muzzle-loaded weapon fired aboard a naval vessel. In theory, there were Dahlgren and Rodman 20-inch guns that were designed for the original flavour of USS Puritan, but since she was never completed, those guns were never installed on a ship, although they were test-fired on land. Arconus asks, what did a naval attaché do all day? The general task of observing the host's navy and advising their own diplomats does not seem to be an entire day-filling occupation to me. How would they spend their leisure time? So a naval attaché is a combination spy, advisor, and diplomat, and then also, depending on the specific mission, like where you are, might also be a trainer, an observer of exercises, and so on and so forth. So a lot of what a naval attaché is going to do depends very much on where that naval attaché is stationed. If you're stationed in a neutral or hostile country, then you're going to lean into much more of the spy role, determining what the enemy's naval capabilities actually really are, by hook or by crook. And you're also going to be advising the diplomat, the ambassador, on naval matters. So, if you're trying to negotiate a treaty or something, then you're going to try and give your diplomat a realistic idea of what the enemy's or potential enemies' capabilities are and how that might factor into your own negotiations with them, as well as obviously trying to get any decent naval secrets back to your own country. Whereas if you are a naval attaché in a country that you're particularly friendly with, then you might still be doing a little bit of spying. Everybody in the diplomatic embassy usually is, but you might also be training the host country's navy, supervising their exercises, liaising with their armaments industry and their naval designers, going out to observe their exercises, or in the case of a conflict, which I got Pakenham up here because he was a naval attaché during the Russo-Japanese War and was present at the Battle of Tsushima, you might actually even be going out with the fleet on its deployments at war. So there's a lot of stuff you could end up doing. Now, of course, part of that is the whole diplomatic, go to receptions, meet people, have formal meetings, lots of discussions that don't usually go all that much of anywhere. But also, of course, depending on where you're going, you might have other things to do, like you might be trying to learn the local language or learn it better, both in terms of better facilitating your activities there and more generally facilitating activities in other parts of your career. So Yamamoto, for instance, who you asked in the expanded question that I abbreviated for the purposes of the Drydock, Yamamoto is touring shipbuilding facilities, he's learning English and observing general culture as well. And that would be part of what you would be doing, visiting ports, looking at the local culture, and again, trying to learn the local language at least as much as you want to or can. Banana Man asks, stainless steel seems perfect for shipbuilding. Why isn't it used much more? Is it just the price that matters, or are there other material differences? There's a number of reasons why you wouldn't use stainless steel in shipbuilding. Now, to be fair, you sometimes do see stainless steel used for elements of the superstructure. But in terms of actual whole shipbuilding, there's a very long list of reasons you don't want to use stainless. For the slightly more modern period that the channel covers, stainless steel is an absolute pig to weld, if you can do it at all, as compared to more regular steels. So that's a big problem. Stainless steel is also very hard on tools. So if you're going to try and drill holes in it to rivet it, because you can't weld it very easily, it's going to cost you an absolute fortune to do, and you're going to need specialist equipment for that. It's also slightly heavier than the average steel. So in a treaty-conscious environment where every kilo or pound of weight matters, using stainless is going to lead to a much heavier hull than not using normal steels. It's also one of the steel types that's actually quite subject to work hardening. So that's the tendency to become more brittle and crack as it gets warped and bent back and forth. And well, hull material, that tends to happen quite quickly. So unless you want your ship to just snap clean in half, just probably steer clear of building any substantial ship out of stainless steel alloys. Now, obviously, some of all of these concerns can be mitigated in the more modern environment using the very specific types of modern stainless steel mixtures, but the cost of those just spirals higher and higher and higher, so you can just use cheaper alternatives. Another problem, which is perhaps less obvious, is actually, believe it or not, rust. So stainless steel, much like a number of other things that theoretically oxidize very quickly, but in day-to-day practice don't tend to be seen as really easy to rust or oxidize away, like aluminium, stainless steel works by forming a protective outer layer of oxidation, which then protects the inner layers. Now, the problem is if you use that underwater, the moving water and the particulates in the water will constantly strip that away and result in more and more corrosion. And if it doesn't, you can also end up with a big problem, which you'll have if you have stainless steel underwater, like a stainless steel hull, and that's called crevice corrosion. So in a low oxygen environment, if your protective layer is scraped away and can't form back easily, especially in areas where you have chloride present, like, say, sodium chloride in seawater, you end up with rust or corrosion that will dive deep into all those little micro fractures and crevices, hence crevice corrosion, that you find in, well, any steel, but in this case stainless steel in particular, and it'll follow those down. And so from the surface, you might look and think, oh, there's a little bit of pitting, a little bit of rust here and there, because as I say, stainless steel is not 100% corrosion resistant. But what's actually happening is internally, all those lovely layers of steel, obviously because of the crystalline structure of the thing, are being forced apart by massive internal occlusions of rust, which you can't see. And in a World War I, World War II environment, you don't really have all that much ability to test for either compared to what we can do these days. And then what happens is at some point, because obviously rust expands things and starts splitting them apart, you will get catastrophic failure completely out of nowhere. And when that's your hull or a major, structural girder or something, that's not a good thing for a ship. Theron Dodd asks, shortly after the Channel Dash on February 26, 1972, Gneisenau was hit by an RAF bombing raid on Kiel. During repairs, it was decided to replace her triple 11-inch gun turrets with twin 15s. However, the work was quickly stopped in early 43. Her two surviving triple 11s were then moved to Norway to serve as coastal defence batteries. Turret Bruno was placed outside Bergen and Turret Caesar was sent to Trondheim. My question is, how were these nearly 1,000-ton turrets moved to Norway? Was it by ship, partway by train? Were they disassembled, fully or partially? And if by ships, which vessels moved them? It was done in pretty much the same way as the turrets had arrived on the ship in the first place. They were essentially fully disassembled, because remember, any turret has to be able to have its roof taken on and off reasonably easily and quickly so that you can access the guns to haul them out for either replacement or relining. And the rest of the turret also has to be, pretty much at least partially assemblable or disassemblable, because when it comes to installing the turret in the ship, you'll end up with the turret base being dropped down onto the barbette, and then you'll have equipment installed onto it, the gun mountings, the guns themselves, and then obviously the armour plating that builds up the sidewalls of the turrets and the roof. All that is put in place, and if you can build it all in place, then you can disassemble it all in place. And at that point, obviously, if you're going to get it to Norway from Kiel, that means you're going to be shipping it. So yeah, the various components were moved by multiple ships. Some regular freighters, because moving big slabs of steel around, that's easily done by most regular freighters. The guns, I believe, needed a specialist gun transportation vessel, but those already existed because Germany was in the business of building heavy naval artillery. And then once they're ashore, yes, you do have to move them by train, because even in a disassembled state, you ain't moving them by truck, certainly not any great distance. And then you have to reassemble them all on site, so that involves a lot of portable cranery and so forth. Nietwiec of Gdansk, I think that's how it's pronounced anyway, asks, with regards to the Japanese Megami-class cruisers, from what's available to me, I've managed to obtain information that the main armament of the Megami and the Tone-class cruisers is about 15 to 20% of their overall cost. You multiply that by 6 ships, and you get the value of all the armament being 90 to 120% of the cost of a brand new cruiser. Now, for the Megamis, if you add in the cost and labour of dismantling the old 6.6-inch armament and the specific design elements you have to put into the ship to allow her to have the twin 8s installed, it seems that the cost of this rearmament would exceed the cost of a new ship. Are these calculations correct? Did they have to abandon an entire cruiser in terms of finances to be able to rearm them later on? Now, while it is true that the Megamis and the Tones were both originally designed with 6.6s, the Tones were never built with 6.6s the way the Megamis were. There were a variety of reasons, including the Fourth Fleet incident, but the Tones had their designs revised and they were built with twin 8s. And obviously there was a fair bit of revision in that design, because obviously they ended up with 4 twins, not 5 triples, but that's a whole other separate discussion in their design process. Now, as far as cost effectiveness was concerned, although there was the idea of rearming the Megamis, that cost wasn't factored into the idea of constructing them. I mean, the Japanese at the time, they were constructing cruisers in a similar way to the way the British were building their destroyers. So the British would build, at least in theory, a class of destroyers that would form a flotilla. So the A class would be one flotilla, the B class would be another flotilla, and so forth. And the Japanese were building their cruisers to form cruiser squadrons, which meant a 4-strong class. Because they weren't building the twin 8s at the same time, they weren't sacrificing any cost at the time when they built the Megamis with the triple 6s. The approval to spend the additional money to build a bunch of twin 8s to stick on the Megamis, that came later on in a separate financial year. So there's no immediate cost implications on could you have built a 5th Megami or whatever. And of course, as you noted in the expanded question, they then went on to reuse the triple 6-inch turrets from the Megamis in various other ships, including the Yamatos, so that while you were spending more money to refit the Megamis, you were also saving money elsewhere because you didn't have to spend money to build triple 6-inch turrets to fit on other Japanese ships that could use them. So overall, it's a cost-neutral solution, minus the labour and the swapping out cost, but that gets eaten up by a lot of refits anyway. And finally, for the first half of the Patreon Drydock, we have Scott Jennings asking, in your opinion, what innovation in naval technology would have had the least effect if it was somehow magically transported back in time 100 years? Let's assume that whoever's receiving that technology would be fully capable of understanding, replicating, distributing, and making proper use of it. I would probably actually go with naval propellants, believe it or not. So the advances in naval propellants since World War II have led to all sorts of interesting things, including, of course, extended range capabilities, and also less wear on barrel. Now, less wear on barrels and therefore extended barrel life would be a useful thing, but ultimately you would still have to replace and reline the barrels occasionally. And let's face it, the need to replace and reline barrels, while it was part and parcel of day-to-day activities in World War I and World War II, because theoretically this is going to be kicked back in time to 1925, so presumably mostly affecting World War II, it's not going to make or break the bank. You know, there's no battle where you can say, oh yes, well this battle would have been won except for this ship that was having its gun barrels replaced because they've been worn out. Yeah, that's not a thing. I mean, it might help the 15-inch monitor that was off the African coast, but that's a very, very minor part of the overall war. The reason why I say it, even if you were able to completely replicate and distribute it, the reason modern naval gun propellants wouldn't be that useful in affecting something like World War II is simply because the single largest thing, the extended range that we get out of them these days, pretty much useless in and of itself in the Second World War, because the fact that your battleship guns can now reach out 40, 45, 50,000 yards, and similarly for all your cruisers and destroyers, completely irrelevant to the fact that your fire control systems aren't capable of calculating a fire control solution out that far, and even if they can, the time of flight is far too long, and even if an enemy ship is dumb enough to sail along quite merrily at that kind of range, with optical-based fire control systems, you can't see far enough to make use of this additional range anyway. So, yeah, I mean, even with radar, okay, once radar comes in, having ultra-long-range guns might be marginally useful, but again, your enemy can maneuver, flight time is not going to be massively affected, and so you're still fairly unlikely to actually hit anything. So yeah, without significant advances in radar and fire control from a modern context as well, simply having guns that can shoot farther doesn't avail you too much in the Second World War, except for maybe in the field of heavy anti-aircraft guns. And that brings us to an end of part 1 of the Patreon Drydock, episode 373. Thank you very much for listening, and hope to see you again in part 2 soon.